Good morning, folks. It's 9 a.m., March 24th, and this is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission weekly meeting. We are letting folks roll into our meeting now. We're up to 36 participants or thereabouts. Let's give another few seconds and then we'll take the roll. All right, we appear to be leveling off around 40. Hearings Manager Amaro, the roll call, please.
Okay. Commissioner Bowe? Here. Commissioner Gonzalez?
Here.
Commissioner McGowan?
Here.
Commissioner Mesner?
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Here.
Commissioner Hackett?
Here.
Commissioner Robbins?
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Thank you. All right. Before we move into our normal business and our agenda, I believe my fellow commissioners would like to take a pause. We have had yet another tragedy in the state of Colorado and in our fair nation, and we should recognize the folks that were involved and take time and think about that. We think it's entirely appropriate. We want to thank our governor and our administration for their leadership during this time. So for this point, let's take 30 seconds and let's all collect our thoughts. Thank you for that, everyone, and hold on to your loved ones and think positively for our state and our nation as we move through yet another one of these tragedies. With that, we move into our agenda, and Director Murphy, you're up next with a short director report. What would you like to report to us this morning?
Thank you, Chair. Again, welcome everybody, and thanks for tuning in. A couple of things, staff is continuing to support the mission change rule implementation. Our meetings, our operator training meetings have moved to bi-weekly. And again, to me, that reflects that the cadence that we're now in is that we need to be, seeing how things work on the ground and responsive as we work through applying the words that we adopted to operations. On the financial assurance rulemaking update, as the commissioners know, the information we received for the informational docket came in on March 15th. I'm excited about the volume and the detail and the engagement from our stakeholders. As a reminder, we'll be having a hearing next week during which stakeholders can present their views, have a dialogue with commissioners, and we will also receive public comments. I think that will be an exceptional opportunity to really get eyes into what folks are thinking. To find more information about this, we'll have a homepage announcement. There's information on the hearings page, and then there's also information on the Senate Bill 181 rulemaking financial assurance page. I wanted to thank again our commissioners and the commissioners from the Air Quality Control Commission for a joint meeting. I think it was a really interesting dialogue around where our organizations are working in the same space and how we can do it efficiently. I think that just sets the stage for the continued collaboration at the staff level that we've really been embarking upon for years now and in a very intense way for the last 18 months. The last piece that I wanted to touch on is to again acknowledge Wendy Schultz, who has been our OGCC budget wizard, for lack of a better term, for going on 14 years now. She officially retired last January-ish. It kind of gets foggy for me because of working from home and COVID, and then came back to help us in a part-time capacity because her depth of knowledge and her experience and her wisdom were so great that I couldn't figure out how to hobble along without her. She has let us know that she is officially fully retiring at the end of this month. She's done an excellent job getting Jarrett, our new budget manager, trained up and ready to go, and he's doing excellent work, guiding us through this very interesting budget year, financial revenue year, and legislative year. But I had to take a moment to again publicly acknowledge what an incredible asset Wendy has been and what an incredible human being she's been. She's been a mentor for me professionally, and she will be missed, and we're so excited that she's going to have more time to focus on her and her wonderful family. So with that, Chair, that's all I had, and thanks for the indulgence on letting me wax eloquently for a little while, or uneloquently for a little while.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Just for our public, we've got 53 some odd folks that are there. We do have on our webpage under SB 19181 and under rulemakings and financial assurances, the informational docket final pre-hearing order is now posted. We're still working on a instruction sheet to allow folks to be able to get to the actual documents. We've moved from a Google Drive format to an e-filing format. We hope to have that instruction sheet up today so that you will know how to actually go access the documents. But I can walk you through it pretty quick. If you go to the home page, if you go to regulation, click on regulation, and then click on hearings.
Chair, can
Yeah.
I interrupt you and maybe screen share so people can watch this?
No, that'd be great. It's been a week and a half and we do need to get this information out for folks. So do you want to screen share?
Hopefully folks can see our homepage.
There you go.
Yep. And Chair, do you want to walk me through and I'll follow your click directions?
Yeah, I think you click on regulation and then click on hearings and then go over to document search on the right-hand side. There you go. And then you want to click on search for docket related documents and then go into the docket number. You insert the special number 2102 00013. And search. And then that is a list of all the documents that have been inserted into the financial assurances informational docket. We are working out the hiccups in this situation. The one thing that you're not able to see is like who actually filed it or what it is. And we're working on getting that fixed. If you click on it and open it up, you can see that this is, for instance, the information from the Board of County Commissioners of Boulder County. We're working to have a layer that would establish that Boulder County was the filer on that spot. And so we hope to get that up, but we'll have these instructions up and running here, hopefully yet today, so that everybody's got that, but you are able to see that we have robust information that has been provided by our stakeholders. All the commissioners have been looking through that, and we appreciate the time and effort of all of our stakeholders to provide comments on this timely and SB 19181 required topic. So Director Murphy, thank you for that screen share. That's much better than me rattling it along without everybody being able to sort of follow through. So appreciate that. Next on our agenda, we have public comment. And I think we have 4 people that are signed up today for public comment. Going to look to hearings manager Amaro to help us with this. I believe that first we have Miss Gaylord, if she's available and with us.
Let her in right now.
Hello, Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Thank you so much for letting me chat today. I just wanted to provide a general comment. As a lifelong Coloradan and a young student, deeply passionate about biodiversity, the health of our public lands and waters, and communities across our beautiful state, I urge you to take action to address climate change. I am very proud to be a Coloradan, and our state has led the charge in many regards, and we do have a chance to lead in addressing the dire crisis that is climate change. The area of Colorado, southwestern Colorado, in which I am lucky enough to live, has been consistently affected by summer wildfires that set records for the largest in state history, as well as intensifying drought and major reductions in stream flows. And every year I see less and less snowpack and more intense dust storms. I am deeply, deeply concerned. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that for a 66% chance of avoiding climate catastrophe by limiting the global average temperature rise no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we must achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the end of 2037, which will require a rapid phase out of fossil fuels. And even in the best case scenarios, communities across our state, the nation, and the globe will be adversely affected by climate change. So last year, the Colorado General Assembly passed SB 19096 and HB 191261, which together do establish greenhouse gas emission reduction goals for 2025, 2030, and 2050. And the oil and gas industry contributes significantly to the climate crisis when potent greenhouse gases, particularly methane, leak into the atmosphere. So we must begin to make deep reductions quickly. We have really no other choice. And so I urge our state agencies and divisions to work together to deploy a robust plan for a rapid and just transition away from oil and gas development in Colorado via managed phase out by 2030, which includes a 10% per year reduction in permitting and 10% per year permanent closure of existing wells, beginning with those that would not meet the COGCC's updated standards, such as those within 2,000 feet of schools or neighborhoods. Thank you so much again for letting me speak today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ms. Gaylord. We appreciate your taking time out of your day and coming and speaking with us. We now have Heidi Leithwood.
Good morning. Thank you for hearing public comment today. I want to echo everything that Ms. Gaylord just said. And I would also like to talk a little bit about SB 181 in the context of conservation and waste, even though I know that you know this bill like the back of your hand, this act like the back of your hand, but I hope you'll humor me in reflecting on it a little bit. Before SB 181, the COGCC was entirely based on the environmental principle of conservation. This principle dates from the first US head of forestry in the early 1900s. Conservation means managing the development and harvesting of a resource for human consumption, and failing to use the resource is considered wasteful. In this utilitarian approach, the natural environment is valued for its use to humans, and it typically uses a cost-benefit analysis. In this approach, it is very difficult to give a monetary value to intangibles such as health, safety, and the environment. One of the things that SB 181 did was to change the ethical framework away from that utilitarian standpoint to a values-based ethics of care. The mandate is now to care for and protect people's health, safety, and to protect the environment. In keeping with this new ethic, SB 181 also changed the definition of waste. 4 times in the revised Oil and Gas Conservation Act, it states outright, waste does not include non-production. It is no longer legally considered wasteful to leave oil and gas in the ground in order to protect health, safety, and the environment. In the joint meeting last week, people on both commissions were expressing a desire to help with the GHG roadmap plan and how can they best do that together. Commissioner Jones said that the reality that oil and gas production needs to be ramped down is not much talked about in the commissions. And I think that's what the public keeps coming back here to talk about. Logical first steps would be to set the bar very high, making it more difficult for companies to get permits, increasing the bond per well, increasing the penalties for infractions, ramping up the enforcement. And then How about not fracking in or around cities? Put a moratorium on fracking within a mile of buildings until more studies can be done. By doing those three things as a first step, we would start fulfilling our legal and moral responsibility, both to protect people's health and to put the brakes on climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Leithwood, for presenting and taking time out of your day to be with us this morning. We appreciate it. We now have Christy Douglas. Ms. Douglas, I see that we've made you a panelist. I think you need to unmute. Ms. Douglas, are you now attending via phone, last digits 19? If so, that should be unmuted. Ms. Vinner, we're going to get to you.
Hello?
Ms. Douglas, is that you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I kept pressing the star, the 6, and over, and you couldn't get in. Yeah, anyway, here I am. So my name is Christy Douglas. I keep coming to you as a concerned citizen of Commerce City and Adams County. I'm a mom, 5 kids, 5 great, they're not great grandchildren, they're wonderful grandchildren. The co-chair of NOCC, North Range Concerned Citizens, but I'm here this morning speaking on my own behalf. I come to you with a really heavy heart this morning. Thank you for honoring those that we lost in Boulder with your moment of silence. So, in order to have those kids, I have a wonderful husband who's worked for King Soopers as a UFCW union member for 43 years. And what happened on Monday hit really close to home. And it makes me realize more and more, especially with my husband being Black and my children being Black, that there are 2 Americas. There are the people who believe in God, guns, and gas. And then there are, and money. And then there are people who just want to live with each other and love each other and honor the lives of each other. I read from the Philadelphia Inquirer my last 2 testimonies. And the reason I did that was because I want you to understand what the people in Pennsylvania are facing with the onslaught of oil and gas development in Pennsylvania. One of our own community members has huge stakes in Pennsylvania in the oil and gas industry, and that would be Mr. Anschutz. He's a multi-billionaire, and yet he sends out people to woo people who have mineral rights to sign over those rights. And so those people are facing destruction and death. Cancer alleys have developed there. I'd like to finish up today by asking you to read the book Amity and Prosperity, One Family and the Fracturing of America. And this is the prologue. It's a note Stacy Hanny posted to the door of her abandoned farmhouse on November 3rd, 2013. To the ignorant, and she uses the word MFers, who keep breaking into my house. It's bad enough that my children and I have been homeless for 2.5 years, but now I have to deal with this. Your greediness has cost me over $35,000 in damages, and the bank has put a forced insurance of $5,000 on my mortgage. January 1st, my mortgage payment goes up to $500 a month. I hope you feel good about what you've done, and I hope you know that the contamination in this causes cancer. So keep coming back, you effing losers. She didn't use the word effing. I hope you rot with cancer. And when you're spending all your scrap money, I hope you think about what you're taking away from my children. Now, I know financial insurances are coming up, and I know I was away for a really long time, and I accused you of doing business as usual, and you tried to say that that wasn't the fact. Well, I think it is. What I want you to do this time is listen to the people, and I want you to also to study the history of mining in Colorado and be very, very careful about issuing new permits, because the wealthy have come here and taken advantage of us time and time again and left us with the ruins. I thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Ms. Douglas. Appreciate you being with us. The final person that had signed up for public comment is Marie Vinner. I think we've seen her in the chat, so I think she's with us. So we will get her on board here.
Thanks so much for helping me through this. I'm a 23-year Colorado business owner and mom, and I sure appreciate being able to participate via Zoom, and that you are also allowing these weekly comment periods. I haven't been here before, but because you have set this up, I am. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. I'm from a 6th generation ag family on one side, and we have 3 generations on each side here in Colorado. I also really appreciate the statements of the women who spoke before me. My nephew works at that King Soopers in Boulder and had friends who died, and I have another nephew who was at the STEM school and the shooting occurred right outside his classroom. So we do have a degree of real craziness, and I would say, you know, disregard of life, with both how fossil fuels are being handled in Colorado and you know, what we continue to see with these shootings. I guess Colorado's the worst state for that. But I come from public service, and I know we can turn this around. and make intelligent decisions. First, I want to emphasize the importance of cumulative impacts. Impacts do not just, again, I come from, having supervised for a Colorado state agency, a staff, who's overseeing permits. We can't keep looking at permits separately. And in fact, I was at CDOT in oversaw the Natural Resources Unit, and the federal agencies would never look at those permits outside of a cumulative impacts framework, for species and for water. And certainly we should have this for people. I think the law guarantees this now. It needs to be in there. We have so elevated, or I've seen elevated with the fossil fuel industry time and time again, the consideration of the profit desires of the 1% over everybody else's health and well-being. And now we see this with, financial assurances too. My understanding is it will cost between 5 and 10 billion, to get these wells closed, and that Coloradans have been left on the hook. This is gross negligence. And I know you as, caring and diligent public servants will want to deal with that. We can't have the likes of Chevron put down 100,000, blanket, whatever they're called, for all of their wells. That is not responsible public service, and it's the Colorado people are greatly endangered in so many different ways. Coming from an ag family, it's especially poignant to me to see the drought projections for our country. I have done research for public agencies for most of my career. And in 2015, a colleague from Germany called me and he said, "Did you see the NASA publication that just came out?" Or, well, he didn't say just came out, he said the NASA publication. And I said, "Oh, I thought he was talking about this 2013 one." And he's like, "No, look at this one. Because in 2013, the drought projections for Colorado, and this is for this century, had some ambiguity given the mountains. We all know the jet stream comes over the mountains and drops moisture. But this one had Colorado entirely browned out. And it was a drought that went from, this is like a Dust Bowl style. They're talking about 30+ year drought. That's what we're on track for, from Kansas to the Central Valley of California. So the agricultural largesse that comes from this area, and it's for the world, not just Colorado, not just for the United States. And my takeaway from that is we were such in the bullseye of this that if it moves west or east or north or south, we are still in the very brownest part of that. So that was 2015. In 2020,
Vinner, you're well past time. If you could start to wrap up, that would be great.
Okay, we're already starting on this. I'm very concerned about financial assurances. 2 wells need to be closed for each one permitted. I support the setbacks and different ways that can be done. You've got to be serving the 99%, not the 1%. This has got to shift if you have any care for your children and the future of our state. And I'm someone who specializes in research in this area, and I am telling you, it is, as a mom, as everything, it's got to be done. And I plead with you to do it. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so that wraps up public comment. We will continue with our agenda. We have this morning with us 4 different local government representatives that are going to present on our continued sort of informational docket in which our stakeholders and we as commissioners learn about others that are involved in oil and gas regulation. Our SB 19-181 rules do encourage collaboration with our local governments across the state. It certainly provided additional authority for local governments. And so with that, we have 4 different presenters that are going to provide us with information as to how their local governments go about the regulation of oil and gas development within their jurisdictions. And so we're interested to listen. We are interested to learn about how local governments regulate the land use aspects of oil and gas development. And so we're excited to have with us these 4 presenters. I think we're going to start with Greg Dean from Adams County. And so if we could see if we could find Mr. Dean, get him on board. I think he also has a PowerPoint that he will be running, or that Ms. Amaro will be running. I see Mr. Dean now. Let me give a little intro to Mr. Dean. He served as the Adams County Oil and Gas Liaison for approximately 1.5 years, where he served as the connection between the Board of County Commissioners, this commission, and other state agencies, local governments, operators, and residents with unincorporated Adams County. Previously, Mr. Dean worked 8 years as a development and operations geologist for various operators across the country. As a geoscientist, he oversaw all aspects of pad and surface infrastructure planning and subsurface wellbore placement. Additionally, he guided the implementation of best management practices and real-time 24/7 drilling and geosteering operations at oil and gas facilities. Mr. Dean holds both bachelor's and master's of science degrees in geoscience and an MBA. And we are excited to have Mr. Dean with us. Personally, I have appreciated Adams County's involvement in our SB 19-181 mission change rules. I thought they brought very good perspective to play. So with that, Mr. Dean, you are up. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen okay?
We can.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Chair Robbins, and good morning, Commissioners, Director Murphy, and others. I appreciate the invitation to address you today, share the great work going on in Adams County. Today, I'll be providing an overview of oil and gas activity in the county, discussing our current permitting and land use review process, and giving an update on our ongoing regulation amendments. So first, an overview of oil and gas development and activity in the county. We are the 2nd largest oil producer in the state. The graph on the left illustrates how our oil production in blue has outpaced the state's in green since 2017, with increases of above 100% year over year. This growth is associated with a huge increase in horizontal development pushing south into the county. 2020 did see a decline in production both statewide and in the county, largely driven by decreases in global demand and crude oil prices, but over 7.4 million barrels of oil was still produced in the county. The red dots on this map represent the nearly 4,000 wellbores throughout the county. 1/4 of these are active wells and 3/4 are P&A'd or dry and abandoned, with 40% of the active wells being shut in or temporarily abandoned. This is quite interesting, as statewide the ratio of active to inactive wells is actually closer to 50-50. This relationship poses a unique situation for the county, as many of our concerns about impacts from historical spills, orphan properties, reclamation, etc., are likely very different than other jurisdictions with less legacy activity to contend with. Adams County began permitting oil and gas facilities in 2016 via special use permits and revised our rules in 2018. We conducted a major overhaul of our regs in late 2019, becoming one of the first jurisdictions to do so after the passage of SB 19-181. To date, the county has issued 24 site permits, with up to 541 laterals being allowed off of those pads. In addition to siting, the county employs 2 full-time oil and gas inspectors with previous and extensive oil field experience that collaborate with COGCC inspectors under an intergovernmental agreement, with a goal to inspect every well site in unincorporated Adams County every year. This is a map of the oil and gas inspections conducted by the county in 2020. We charge operators directly for these routine inspections and have our own enforcement mechanisms, including penalties and fines for documentable violations. Last year, even with delays related to the pandemic, we conducted more than 500 well facility inspections. Our environmental program and planning teams also consist of an environmental compliance inspector, stormwater inspectors, and a newly hired public health policy specialist. On the screen now is a map of part of our main oil producing corridor. There are currently 26 active and drilled multi-well pads countywide. The pink shapes denote some of these locations in the county and near our border, mainly with Broomfield and Weld counties. We have siting jurisdiction over the unincorporated portions of our county, which contains a full range of highly urbanized areas in the west and expansive rural settings to the east. Our jurisdiction is actually very closely intertwined with several municipalities that have their own views and regulations on oil and gas, the largest being Thornton in yellow, Brighton in purple, as well as Commerce City and Aurora, which are east and south of this map. So therefore, having and maintaining good communication and working relationships with our municipal partners is critical for land use planning and permitting. So this is a simplified flow chart of the county's current land use process for evaluating oil and gas applications. I acknowledge there's a lot of information on this slide, so bear with me. We adopted the standard in September 2019 after 181. Our process is called an Oil and Gas Facility Permit, or OGF. The first step on the left is a conceptual review and pre-application. This is where the alternative site analysis occurs. The county requires an alternative site analysis for all applications. This process requires operators to present a minimum of 3 unique locations that are at least 1,000 feet apart from each other and can require any evaluation materials on a proposal by proposal basis necessary to determine at a high level if any of those sites are appropriate or sufficiently protected, including traffic and noise analyses as examples. Part of this review includes an evaluation against setbacks, which are currently set at 1,000 feet from residences, high occupancy buildings, platted residential development, schools, and environmentally sensitive areas. We also review proposed sites for land use zoning compatibility. Currently, the county restricts OGF permitting to only some agricultural, commercial, and industrial zone districts and prohibits oil and gas activity in any areas zoned residential. If no proposed sites satisfy the review criteria for land use compatibility, future land use designation, or protectiveness measures, the county may recommend denial at this stage, even before an official application is ever submitted. Once a location passes the conceptual review, an operator can then move on to step 2 and apply for an OGF. This is a back and forth evaluation, discussion, and review between the operator, referral agencies, and the public, often through multiple submittals and resubmittals to ensure compliance with all county performance standards and regulations. At this stage, we review potential offsite impacts and collaborate with applicants and the stakeholders to introduce and devise BMPs and/or facility design changes that will mitigate or avoid these impacts. Many of our performance standards focus on the site-specific nature of oil and gas, and we, by regulation, can require noise modeling or noise restrictions, pipeline usage, expanded containment requirements, environmental reviews, regular neighborhood meetings, traffic route delineation and restrictions, as just some examples. After often several rounds of review and comment, staff makes its final recommendation to our department director for approval with conditions, or denial. The director can approve a permit administratively that meets all the development standards and review criteria and does not require any waivers. The director may also send any OGF to our Board of County Commissioners for a public hearing and vote. After approval, permits are valid for 3 years and generally vest once one well has been drilled and completed before that expiration, with no extensions being granted. Prior to construction and drilling of a site, the operator must obtain a notice to proceed from us that requires the remittal of applicable traffic impact fees, proof of all conditions precedent being met, and valid COGCC permits in hand. The county also has defined standards for what would constitute a major or minor change to an approved permit. A major amendment would include any changes to the footprint, orientation, or disturbance area. It also would include additional wells above what were previously approved, or an increase in on-site storage as examples. Major changes require an entirely new permit that must go through the same process over again. A minor amendment includes the addition or swapping out of production equipment, or changes or alterations that do not impact the overall character of the development, and those can be processed administratively. So we are currently revising our OGF regulations for alignment with recent adopted commission rules. On the screen now is a comparison table of regulation topic areas on the left and the review of current county standards relative to the new COGCC rules on the right. The starred items are areas the county will be focusing on in our first phase of amendment, which is ongoing. The use of the phraseology alignment with commission rules is very intentional, rather than using meet, match, or mirror, because the co-equal regulatory framework does not dictate that the county must meet or exceed the state standard, and 181 specifically allows us to adopt more protective rules. As part of these changes, we intend to expand our pre-application process discussed earlier to automatically include the COGCC and CPW as referral agencies. We believe the COGCC should be involved in our permitting process to ensure any major issues at the state level can be identified, avoided, and mitigated early. We agree with the Commission, as stated in the rulemaking, that alternative location analysis is a great tool for avoiding impacts, and believe it is appropriate for the Commission to be involved, at the very least, in this stage of our application. So I won't elaborate on all the proposed changes, but we'll share some of the more impactful ones. Staff has recommended to our board that these changes will be prospective to new applications and not retroactive to existing sites or permits. Also, these are simply proposals, and the details of such will be evaluated during our stakeholder and hearing processes. So first, we are proposing revisions to our noise provisions. Part of this includes maintaining the adoption of the COGCC's noise standard in the county rule, and requires an operator to demonstrate compliance with the submission of ambient background noise studies and noise modeling for all applications during each phase of operations. We are further recommending requiring an operator to commit to complying with the lowest maximum permissible noise levels in Rule 423 for all sites that are located within 2,000 feet of a land use designation boundary. This map is an example of a proposal from an actual pad in our county. So if a proposed pad is on a parcel zoned agricultural, for example, but there are residentially zoned parcels within that 2,000-foot buffer, the lower residential noise standard would apply. This would be a pseudo noise setback of 2,000 feet. If adopted, these changes would make Adams County's regulations more protective than the state standard. We are further suggesting the addition of a cumulative impacts plan in the county rules. This would be an entirely new concept in our regulations and require both a qualitative and, where necessary, a quantitative evaluation and discussion of cumulative impacts from incremental increases from all reasonably foreseeable development of oil and gas and heavy industrial operations within 1 mile, with specific measures proposed to avoid or minimize impacts. This plan submission would also need to demonstrate compliance with the new commission standards, specifically the air emissions and hazardous air pollutant estimates. Staff plans to actively engage stakeholders, and especially COGCC and CDPHE staff, in devising evaluation and review criteria at the county level. However, we initially suggest our evaluation of cumulative impacts will focus on the qualitative and be incorporated into our overall final recommendation of a proposal, rather than adopting specific impact thresholds. Lastly, the county is proposing changes to our setback requirements. We are recommending that all oil and gas facilities must be 2,000 feet or more from any existing residential or high occupancy buildings or platted residential lots, schools, environmentally sensitive areas, or designated parks and open spaces. The measurement of these setbacks is proposed to be from the edge of max disturbance to a property line. Staff has initially recommended maintaining the county's ability to grant administrative waivers for some setbacks if an operator can get written consent from each resident and property owner located within the setback. If such cannot be obtained, the waiver could still be granted after a public hearing in front of our board. At that hearing, the operator must demonstrate the criteria for approval could be met via substantially equivalent protection in the form of facility design, reduced extent and severity of impacts, proposed mitigation, and best management practices. This substantially equivalent determination will be made by our Board of County Commissioners. So this map demonstrates the primary differences between how the Commission measures setbacks from a working pad surface to a physical structure, which is shown in teal, versus how the county measures from the edge of disturbance to a parcel line, denoted in yellow. Generally, the denser the development, the less significant this difference is. This will have greater impacts further east and north as the development transitions from dense residences to more estate residential and residential associated with agricultural areas. The intention of including platted development and the use of parcel lines is to protect citizens whose homes may be built or altered after initial permitting, but prior to the commencement of operations, and from those operators who choose to make subsequent trips to a pad over time. This somewhat subtle distinction allows citizens to retain the full use of their backyards and property for recreation, agriculture, or other uses, and allows our setbacks to be analyzed more quantitatively during review. By virtue of how we measure setbacks, if adopted, this would make the county setback standards more protective. So this map depicts the principle on a larger county-wide scale, with the yellow depicting the 2,000-foot measurement from a footprint compared to the orange shape, which is the same setback measured to a parcel line. Displayed now is an enlarged map of the main oil-producing corridor within unincorporated Adams County with our current 1,000-foot setbacks. The gray areas are outside our jurisdiction. The orange, pink, and red shapes represent near the current 1,000-foot setbacks from residences, schools, and childcare centers, and the blue shapes are 1,000-foot setbacks from environmentally sensitive areas. The hatched black and white is agriculture 3 zones and can be generally interpreted when viewing this map as areas that meet the setback distances and could be permitted. From this map, under current rules, some areas in western Adams County and north near Highway 7 to the border with Weld, as well as areas further east, could be deemed appropriate for oil and gas from a strictly setback perspective. So I encourage you to keep your eye on this map because the next slide will actually show the impact of our new proposed setbacks on oil and gas development. So this is the same map extent under our recommended setbacks. For reference, the orange is depicting the proposed 2,000-foot setback from residences. The teal is a conforming state setback of 1,000 feet from Goody wells. And the blue is a 2,000-foot setback from environmentally sensitive areas. Looking at the hatched black and white areas, you can see, if adopted, this would limit future oil and gas siting mainly to eastern portions of the E470 corridor around DIA and locations east, without an exception or waiver being granted. These maps further illustrate and support our recommendation for defined exceptions from the county setbacks to allow siting closer than 2,000 feet in other areas of the county, but only in some site-specific instances and after a public hearing. So lastly, this is our initial timeline for these amendments, read from left to right. We have already held our first round of preliminary stakeholder meetings to solicit general remarks and received input from our citizen-led planning commission and direction from our board of county commissioners. I'm currently composing the first draft and associated red lines, and we'll release them to the public and referral agency in early April. We plan to directly engage commission staff and are hopeful for their active participation in the process. We'll hold more stakeholder meetings, public information sessions, and seek direction from our board throughout the spring based on the outcome of this public engagement, and we'll release a second draft for another official comment period in late May. Final rules will be heard and adopted at a public hearing in July. That's all I have for you. Thank you again, Chair Robbins and the other commissioners for the invitation. I look forward to continued collaboration between our agencies in the future, and I am available for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. I think that at this point we do have allocated some time for Q&A and dialogue between commissioners and yourself. I guess I can start. I had one question I jotted down as you were presenting. You, in one of your slides, the current regulatory protocol establishes a distinction between an administrative approval and a public hearing and approval by the Adams County Commissioners. Can you elaborate on the distinction there? When would something be subject to administrative approval versus approval by commissioners at public hearing? And do you anticipate that that distinction, excuse me, will be addressed in your new regulatory review?
Great question. So generally, an administrative approval can be granted if a proposed site meets all of our performance standards and review criteria. That is, it meets the setbacks, it meets all of our regulations for noise, air quality, et cetera, and there aren't any non-administrative waivers needed. In those instances, then the director can approve it administratively. Even if all those are true, the director may still send it to the Board of County Commissioners if they feel like it warrants more public input. And then, of course, if there's any waivers needed from our setbacks, from any of our performance standards, then it automatically goes to our Board of County Commissioners for public hearing. Staff has proposed to maintain both of those provisions in the new rules. So this would give our director the ability to approve a permit. It's meant mostly for those areas in rural Eastern Adams County that will probably not have any problems meeting our residential setbacks of 2,000 feet and our environmental setback of 2,000 feet. It's meant to speed up that process, but with the new 2,000 foot setback, as you can see on one of these maps, let me go back to the previous map. You can see on this map, there aren't a lot of locations that are going to not need a waiver from our Board of County Commissioners. So we maintain that provision. We don't anticipate it's going to be used very often because most of them are probably going to require a waiver from one of the setbacks, whether it's the school, residential or environmental setback.
Thank you, Mr. Dean, for that answer. Looking to other commissioners with questions, Commissioner Gonzalez and then Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Dean, for the presentation. Very helpful and informative slides. I appreciate it. I've got a question about the setbacks against platted locations, right? And so when we talk about that, you're talking about planned development, but not yet development. Have y'all given any thought, or do you guys have anything in place in regards to oil and gas development that comes ahead of platted development? Not with regard to setbacks, but in terms of how that platted development will move forward from a county perspective when it is, coming within that setback, when it is essentially, violating what would be a setback from the oil and gas location.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we cover that in our code under reciprocal setbacks or reverse setbacks. So essentially, if a site has been, an oil and gas facility has been permitted, any subsequent platting of residential development has to yield to the oil and gas permit. And that means that any plat needs to be a minimum of, currently our reverse setbacks are 250 feet from an oil and gas site. So any platting has to be 250 feet from a permitted or existing oil and gas facility. Now we're gonna probably amend that, but that's not in our first phase of our amendments. We're probably gonna do that at the end of this year and into 2022. But currently it's kind of who gets permitted first. If the site is permitted and they have a valid permit, oil and gas permit, then a developer has to meet the 250-foot reverse setback. We also have reverse setbacks from P&A wells of 50 feet by 100 feet with no permanent structures being allowed inside of that 100-foot by 50-foot buffer. And we also have a notification requirement currently set at 300 feet for a developer needs to get a signed affidavit from the property buyer acknowledging that they are aware of permitted or drilled wells within 300 feet of their property.
Thank you.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dean. It's really helpful. Nice to see you again.
Yes.
So my question is going to be along the same lines as Commissioner Gonzalez, and I think I'm probably going to be interested in hearing from each of the speakers about this. I think there's, based on testimony and some visits, that reverse setbacks are pretty frustrating for homeowners. And it's interesting to me to hear, could you explain again what's required for a developer if the well is going to be within a certain distance of the home, what the homeowner needs to sign so that they know what's going to happen? Sorry.
Yeah, so the way that the code is currently written, and we haven't actually had to deal with this, most of our reverse setbacks have been applied to already drilled sites. So we haven't had to deal with permitted undrilled next to platted development yet. So I can't tell you exactly how that process is going to look, but the developer or anyone selling a piece of property within 300 feet of a permitted oil and gas site needs to get a signed affidavit from the person purchasing the property, acknowledging that they are aware of its existence, that a proposed pad is there. Obviously, if we know residential development is going to be occurring the other way around while we're permitting, we would probably apply the 2,000-foot setback to that. The issue being, if they happen at the same time, it becomes kind of interesting that if an oil and gas facility is permitted and then 2 years from now they decide they want to drill there, but buildings have already been built 250 feet away, then that would not be protective enough. So it's kind of, we haven't had to deal with it yet, and so that's a great question. I assume that's something our county attorneys are going to need to look into, how we regulate that. That also goes into the permit term, the 3-year permit term. Obviously, you got 3 years to drill your wells, and if you don't, then you're gonna have to reapply. And if in that 3-year time period, a developer has come in and say, hey, I want to build a whole bunch of residential buildings over here, they're not gonna get re-permitted. That's just the nature of it. But that is something we definitely need to dive into, like I said, in our next phase of amendments. And we want to engage our home builders associations. And we also are looking to adopt some reverse or reciprocal setbacks for other industrial operations like open pit mining, things like that, gas stations, things like that in the county, and not just for oil and gas.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. It's really helpful to know that that local governments are trying to work through this. I'm also curious to know if you could talk a little bit about the relationship with the jurisdictions adjacent and any kind of, do you have MOUs worked out with them, or is it just conversations between the commissioners and city councils about if development's going to happen, you know, on the border, how that is done in a way that's orderly or with open communication, and do you have some examples of success or non-success?
Yeah, that's a great question. And relationships with our municipal partners is critical. Historically, our Board of County Commissioners has treated all Adams County citizens and all Adams County development, regardless of what jurisdiction they're under, the same. So we, in unincorporated Adams County, apply our setbacks to even development that isn't in unincorporated Adams County. So if there is platted development in the city of Thornton that's within 2,000 feet of an unincorporated pad, we would honor our setback and not permit it there. I'm not aware of any specific MOUs specific for oil and gas between our municipal partners to do that. It's mostly been like a handshake type of agreement where we acknowledge that if they have the setbacks, they're going to apply those setbacks to all citizens and not just whatever jurisdiction they live in. Same thing goes for, and I can only speak for Adams County, we would do the same thing for Weld County citizens. And there's a lot of development on our northern border with Weld County, and right over our border in Weld County, the unincorporated county would honor a building in Weld County as our setback. And that would just be, that's how our commissioners have handled protections for citizens. They don't care if they're City of Thornton residents or not. And again, it's challenging because a lot of our development has been in the past where there haven't been we haven't had to apply it yet. And so it's kind of interesting to see. It's going to be interesting when it actually happens. And I guarantee you it will, as our county is growing so fast. And another issue is we had one permit submitted to us in unincorporated Adams County. Then that acreage was annexed by the city of Aurora. And then it was kind of confusing as, okay, this permit's already been worked through by Adams County. We haven't approved it yet. So then we had to transfer everything to the city of Aurora. So that's also something that, again, hasn't really reared its head yet on a larger scale, but I imagine it will be in the future.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dean, for that overview. I mean, it is always impressive to see the work that Adams County is doing in this arena. I do have a few questions. I'll start by just following up with the kind of this initial line of questioning. And so the reverse setback concept, I mean, I assume because at least the forward permitting is going to be only allowed in industrial, commercial, agriculture, that in order for residential development to occur within those setbacks, there probably has to be a zoning change for that to occur. And, you know, what kind of, I mean, I guess, how does oil and gas activity play into that contemplated zoning change?
So that's an excellent question. And you are correct. Most of the time when a dense residential development gets platted, a rezoning is required. And the rezoning actually occurs usually much earlier than the platting does. And so once that zone is approved, if it becomes residential, then that site would no longer be applicable to oil and gas. So again, it's which comes first. Is the zoning changed first, or is the oil and gas facility permit submitted first? We also have a special, and I think most jurisdictions do, a PUD land use designation where you can work it out with all stakeholders, the understanding of, okay, this is going to be residential, but there is planned oil and gas here as well. And so then we can create a special planned unit development that would allow dense residential and oil and gas if it were appropriate. And that's usually when the operator and the developer work together to come to an agreement that, for instance, there's an area in unincorporated Adams County where the Gus Cordovan and tower pads sit. They came to an agreement with that developer that they would delay their residential development until after the wells were drilled so that there wasn't this back and forth issue. So this is something the county would like to encourage in the future with oil and gas development and residential developers. And we've had good luck so far in that one example. So we're hoping that's kind of how it's going to go in the future.
No, I appreciate that. And then, and this kind of brings me to my next question, which is understanding that the reverse setbacks 250 or 300 feet, but yet you'd apply the 2,000 foot setback should the drilling have not occurred yet. Are you most concerned then about the actual drilling activity and the impacts on residents versus ongoing operations after that initial drilling phase has occurred?
That's absolutely right. And again, we haven't brought this to our board yet, so I'm speaking from myself and my opinion on impacts from oil and gas. Historically, we haven't felt like a setback, a reverse setback, is necessary at the same level as a forward setback. And that's because most of the impacts associated with oil and gas are pre-production. That's construction, drilling, completion, flowback. And once a site actually goes into production and has had interim reclamation done to it, the impacts drop off dramatically. And the CDPHE study showed as much. We also don't receive any complaints about noise or air quality from sites that are already in production. So initially, we feel like a reverse setback does not need to be as high as a forward setback. Now, is 250 feet adequate? That's something we're going to have to work through in our stakeholder process in our next phase of amendments. But I don't believe it needs to be 2,000 feet reverse. Also, that really does inhibit development, and we want to try to find that balance between oil and gas development and future residential, commercial, agricultural development.
Mr. Chair, I've got a few more questions, if that's okay. So a little bit about the municipal relationship piece. Understanding that I assume the majority of the municipalities within Adams County are home rule municipalities, and we heard a little bit about the authorities that home rule municipalities have. Do you receive any pushback from those municipalities as far as exerting some authority to determine whether or not oil and gas can be permitted within those jurisdictions?
So we haven't to date received any pushback from our partners. Here's a map. And I say that because while we do have a lot of municipalities, those municipalities are generally very densely developed. So there isn't actually a lot of oil and gas inside of the municipalities. For instance, the city of Thornton, I believe has one pad, multi-well pad in it. I think Brighton has maybe 4 or 5. And so operators generally seek out open areas, which generally occur in unincorporated Adams County. So the jurisdiction typically falls with us for siting. And that goes back to my previous statement that our board historically has enforced all rules and regulations on any citizen, protecting any citizen regardless of their jurisdiction. So we haven't had any pushback from, say, the city of Brighton, who's mad at us for permitting a site close to their border. Likewise, the city of Thornton seems to take a more of a hands-off approach when it comes to oil and gas. And so same thing, when City of Thornton's comments on an unincorporated Adams County permit, we take that as though it was an unincorporated citizen. Or if they file a complaint with us, we treat that as if it was an unincorporated citizen filing a complaint. So I hope that answers your question. We haven't had any that I'm aware of. The biggest pushback we've had is actually with Broomfield. And that was our board got very, very angry. We protested all those permits and those extraction permits along Broomfield's border. And that's one of those weird things. This was pre-181 world, pre-proximate local government rule, where kind of Adams County was limited in our recourse for submitting comments and having standing at the commission, things like that. So we're hoping to avoid things like that in the future.
I appreciate that. A couple more questions here. I'm just curious about your setbacks and the utilization of the term max disturbance. I guess I've not totally understanding what that, what is the max disturbance area?
Great question. So max disturbance area, this sounds like a silly answer, is the area that's disturbed. That would include any stockpiles of soil. It would include any storage that they want to use temporarily on site for drilling equipment, things like that. It would include everything, not just areas outside of the sound walls. Any retention ponds or any pits that, I mean, we don't permit pits, but any anything temporary, any place, any grading, sediment, erosion controls that we were requiring, that would be part of the maximum disturbance area. And that's where we would measure our setbacks from. Again, because we believe that impacts are greatest during construction, drilling, and completion operations. And so on this map, you can see the teal box is the working pad surface. That's how the commission would measure setbacks. Right. The yellow is how we would measure setbacks. And so that would, because interim reclamation could typically take anywhere between 3 and 5 years to occur, technically they can be utilizing this max disturbed area for ongoing operations, temporary storage, things like that. So we want to make sure that we're protecting our citizens. We also measure to a parcel line for that same exact reason. We don't want to even get into the nitty gritty of, is that a garage or is that a shed? We don't care. If it's their backyard, that should be protected in the county's opinion. I think we advocated for something similar during the rulemaking process. So it looks on this map not to be that big of a deal between working pad surface and max disturbance area, but it's bigger deal when you become less densely developed, because then this small change actually could intersect a lot more parcels, which would require informed consent from those citizens before oil and gas can be permitted there.
Sure. All right, I'm almost done here. So based on the chart, as far as your review process goes, and thanks, Chair Robbins, you asked a question that I was going to ask as well, so that's helpful. But do you envision the Adams County permitting and the COGCC permitting moving forward to be sequential or concurrent, or some mixture of the two?
I envision it to be, once you get to step 2, I envision it will be concurrent. So we would like to get the pre-app conceptual review taken care of before they submit an application to the state, which is why we really want to include COGCC and CPW as referral agencies in that pre-application process. Because if there's something that we're missing, or there's something glaring that the state level wants to make comment on, we want to rectify it before they even submit their permit application. After that, I imagine, and historically the commission and the county have worked really well together, especially in the recent past. And so I imagine with that relationship continuing, it won't be an issue for us to run concurrently with the state. With the understanding, and this falls on the operator to understand, any changes that they make once they've submitted an application to us could restart their process. And so it's kind of on the operator to understand that. For instance, if as part of the state review, they say, well, hey, that access road actually needs to come from the north because there's a wildlife habitat there. But this county has already approved that pad with the access road on the south, well, then they're gonna have to restart the process. So that's why it actually makes sense to do it together, because if we haven't approved the permit yet, changing the access road from the south to the north is actually just a resubmittal, and it doesn't reset anything. It doesn't cancel all the work we've already done, all the review we've done, all the comments we've received. It would just be a resubmittal. We'd send it back out for some comments from our referral agency, specifically CPW, probably in this example, and then move forward with our process. So we'd like to see them work together so that we're not getting stuck in this process where because once we permit something, it's locked in, and there's just not a lot of wiggle room in our regulations for changes. And so we kind of want to avoid having to redo a lot of work. I'm the only oil and gas liaison at the county. I'm also the project manager and primary reviewer for all oil and gas applications. So that's a lot for me to have to do over and over and over again.
Sure. All right, last question. I mean, impressive level of staffing, though, as far as, specific professional staff around oil and gas development in Adams County. I wonder if you just go a little more into detail about your kind of compliance protocol. So after this has been permitted and you're either in the drilling operations pre-completion or completion, or after that production, I understand that you're doing inspections annually. Is there other details around that compliance piece? Particularly, I'm interested around this public health policy professional.
So she's our public health policy special isn't new. I think she's been with the county for 2 weeks, maybe. So how she's going to be intertwined in oil and gas specifically, she's not just an oil and gas professional. She's in our environmental programs team. So she does public policy, public health. She's doing COVID work right now. So she will be intertwined somehow in oil and gas. To what extent is kind of unclear at this moment. From the inspection piece, yeah, of course we do our annual inspections for compliance with, because we have an intergovernmental agreement with the commission, we can enforce our rules and we can also cite for violations of the state rules. And so they're trained on both. And so a citation can be issued by the county and by the state in those cases. We also don't charge for a complaint-based inspection. So if we get a complaint of a loud piece of production equipment and they go out and inspect it, we have sound meters and equipment like that we can confirm compliance with the COGCC noise standards. And if there isn't a noise issue, then the case is closed. And we also don't charge the operator for things like that. We also don't charge for follow-up inspections. So once they get inspected, they get a letter saying, hey, we inspected your Smith 1 well, and you had these corrective actions. You've got, depending on the severity of the correction, 1 month to change them, to fix them, and provide proof that you fixed it, and we'll be back out in a month to re-inspect. And if not, then we will start the violation process. So that's kind of how the county process works for inspections. Does that answer your question? I apologize if
it does. No, that was good. And I'm sorry for so many questions, but I thought as you're doing.
Great dialogue, Commissioner Messner. That's what we're here for. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just wanted to echo the thanks for the presentation. I think it was very helpful. Really interesting to see the whole process that you all have established, and I appreciated your clarification on alignment versus meeting, matching, and mirroring. A lot of my other questions have been addressed by the questions that the other commissioners asked, so I really appreciate, especially with respect to the sort of reciprocal setbacks, et cetera. The one thing I was curious about with relation to that is knowing that in our prior 30,000 foot level presentation on counties and municipalities, that we heard that counties are typically reliant on property tax. And I was curious in kind of establishing these newer setbacks and, some of the things that you're contemplating in the future, has that required you to reconsider your income sources, or how has that shifted things for you from a revenue standpoint?
So excellent question. That is like 3 steps above my pay grade. So I don't know the specific answers to that. Historically, the commissioners have taken the approach that public health, safety, and welfare comes first. especially lately with all the changes occurring at the state level relating to oil and gas. They've been more concerned with, does a facility protect public health and safety? That's not just for oil and gas. We've had some permits recently for open pit mines and things like that. And, you know, some industry proponents will say, well, this is bringing a lot of revenue into the county. And the commissioners have always just taken the stance that, you know what, like, it doesn't matter what those income levels are. We're going to figure out a way to make it work. So I can't speak for the commissioners exactly that they're always, you know, we don't take into consideration financial things, but of course, public health and safety has always been a priority for our commissioners. So, and I can't speak to like a quantitative analysis of revenue estimates based on setbacks or prohibiting oil and gas development or things like that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And also, you know, you already noted that if a zoning change is required because of a new proposed residential development, that your new setbacks would apply. But you also mentioned in the instance where there's already a permitted location, that the reverse setback would come into play, and sort of the negotiations between the developer and the operator with respect to kind of when construction might occur for the residential. I just wanted to clarify, that is not a requirement, is that correct? To wait for that period, but it is just the 250-foot setback is the primary requirement. Is that correct?
Correct. There is not a requirement to work with, for developers to work with operators or vice versa, or for the county to work with. I mean, we're not the arbiter. We're not the, you know, we don't hold everyone's hand and say, like, let's come to an agreement. That's not our role as a county. We're hopeful and we support those types of discussions and those types of partnerships. But at the end of the day, we will adopt permits or grant permits based on our land use regulations, performance standards, and things like that. And if a developer wants to change the zoning, there's nothing in our rules that will stop him from doing that, him or her from doing that. So obviously we like to have good partnerships with our developers and with our operators and with all of our applicants, but it's not required. Again, we haven't, well, I mean, luckily, knock on wood, we have not had to deal with that on a large scale yet. But it's making me very nervous that you know something that I don't, because I'm getting very nervous for future development and how that might actually look.
Yeah, no, nothing that I know of. Thank you. But I just was, I was just curious. I mean, I think that is, as you noted, or it's interesting too that you said that the complaints received are far fewer when you're past that drilling and completion phase. And so, yeah, I was just kind of curious how that related to the current rules or contemplated rules, not to get you to, you know, predict the future, but I just was curious about where that fell currently.
Yeah, and so most of our complaints after production are actually traffic related, like trucks coming on and off location or mud tracking from the facility onto the roads. For that reason, we currently don't require, but we can, the use of pipelines for oil and gas and produce water. And every multi-well pad in Adams County and unincorporated Adams County is connected to an oil pipeline. I can't imagine an instance where we would permit something that was being proposed not to be connected to a pipeline for that very reason. We don't want long-term traffic on our roads, especially if we know there's going to be a residential development across the street. We don't want heavy trucks coming in and off that location.
Thank you so much. And you actually just reminded me of one more question, Mr. Chair, if that's all right to proceed. My understanding from what you said is that the setbacks, both for the forward-looking and the reverse, is on the surface level and using the sort of measurement that you mentioned with the maximum disturbed area. Is there consideration of the location of below ground flow lines, pipelines, et cetera?
So, great question. It's not currently in our rules specifically to allow that. It's definitely going to be, we need to do some work on how we classify a reverse setback. Is it from a wellhead? Is it from a pad? Is it from a piece of equipment. Historically, we've had great luck with our developers who acknowledge that those impacts are real and that they've been willing to set back from that production equipment or from the edge of that pad to 250 feet. That's something we'll probably require once we actually amend them, in addition to potentially expanding that 250 feet out further. But currently, no, there's nothing in our code that specifically requires it, but we have great working relationships with all of our applicants. We've been lucky to be able to avoid those.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Dean. Those are all my questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces. So especially with reciprocal setbacks, and which is why we propose to push it to phase 2, because with everything else we're amending, setbacks and cumulative impacts, there's just a lot to do in one fell swoop. And we know we have operators who are chomping at the bit to submit new applications to us. And so we want to get our rules revised as quickly as possible.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Dean, what is the process for permitting, for platting residential parcels in Adams County? And typically, how long does it take if there's an approval process, to receive approval for platted residential parcels?
Well, that's a tough question, and I don't know the exact answer to it, to be completely honest. I know it generally starts with a rezoning if necessary. So for instance, if it's an agriculture 3, our code requires a certain parcel size for an ag 3 zone. If they're proposing to chop that up into 100 little pieces, that A3 zone would no longer be appropriate. And so with A3 zones, there are restrictions on the number of houses you can build and how far apart those houses have to be. So developers generally want to rezone to something that allows for more dense development. That process can take anywhere between 6 months and a year. And so generally, we know when development is going to occur. So if we have an application going through the queue for a residential development, I imagine that'd be a conversation we'd have to have with our operator. Let them know that, hey, this plat is about to be approved and it's going to have 150 lots right next to where you want to build an oil and gas site. So you're probably going to need to move that.
And Mr. Dean, would it be safe to say that without a rezoning, staying within the same zone and within the same zoning requirements, that platting additional residential parcels in that zone would take considerably less time than that 6 months to a year?
Yeah, if a rezone wasn't required, it would probably go quicker. You could also get an exception or a waiver from a zone requirement, but that could take a long time. So like an A3 zone, and these are just example numbers. For an A3 parcel, I think the minimum size is 10 acres or something like that. We'd only allow, I think, 1 residential development on that 10-acre parcel. So if a developer even wanted to build 1 other house, they'd have to either split that parcel in 2, and if that parcel size then dropped below 10 acres, a rezone would be required. So if they wanted to say, well, I want to chop it in half and build a second house, well, now your parcels are 5 acres. So now it's not A3 anymore, it's A2. So now you have to rezone to A2.
That helps. I appreciate that. I'm just trying to kind of build out the timeline and the scenario of what that interaction is between the timing of development with a 3-year permit, the commencement of operations potentially at the end of that 3 years, how long it takes to get a plat, and where that intersection may cause some problems. So just thinking through it as I'm kind of learning about the new Adams County proposed regs and what's in place. So I appreciate the explanations there. Thank you.
Other questions from commissioners? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Dean. We look forward to, we, number one, appreciate your explanation of the Adams County current process and potentially where you're going. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with the county as we both establish and work forward with our oil and gas regulatory processes.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for all the great questions. Those are a lot of those questions. Now I have to start thinking in my head, how is that process going to work? Because again, we haven't had to deal with it historically, and so, but our development has just ramped up over the last 5 years in Adams County, and so it's growing rapidly. So thank you again for all those great questions.
Excellent. All right. We had 4 presenters this morning, commissioners. We will now turn, and I think the segue makes some sense, to Elizabeth Paranos, who is a representative of Aurora, as well as some of the other affiliated local governments from our rulemakings. Thank you, Elizabeth, for attending with us this morning. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Chairman Robbins, and hello, Commissioners and Director Murphy. Happy to be here with you today. I will say my talk or presentation this morning is quite distinct from what you just heard from Adams County. So hopefully this will give you a different perspective. And I think Ms. Amaro is going to present my slides. So
I shall. I'm going to share screen. Just one moment.
Perfect. Thank you. I guess while she's putting those up, I'll just start. Great. Thank you so much. So in my opinion, the city of Aurora presents a very interesting use case to demonstrate the intersection of land use, water use and protection, and oil and gas planning. The city is expanding. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Especially to the east, and so preserving land for residential development is a high priority. In addition, the city is one of the largest holders of groundwater in the state of Colorado, and is the largest holder of groundwater rights in the Denver Basin Aquifer. So accordingly, preserving and protecting groundwater is a very important priority for the city. In addition, there are significant oil and gas minerals that underlie the city, and so it makes it a prime area for potential and current oil and gas development. You can go to the next slide. Prior to the passage of SB 19-181, when the city was constrained in terms of its ability to regulate oil and gas development to adequately protect its interest in safeguarding the residential areas and its groundwater and groundwater transportation infrastructure, which the city calls critical infrastructure, the city identified the use of operator agreements as a mechanism to plan for oil and gas development while also protecting these other interests. For those of you unfamiliar with operator agreements, they allow local governments to negotiate with oil and gas companies to secure more protective best management practices than otherwise would have been allowed by local regulation, and have a greater say over the location of oil and gas development and also when it proceeds and how it proceeds. So prior to the passage of 19-181, the city started negotiations with 3 different operators: Axis Exploration, Elevations Midstream, and ConocoPhillips. Axis and Elevations are subsidiaries of Extraction Oil and Gas. For the operators, the agreements provided for local approval by City Council of the locations for 49 well sites, some of which were pre-existing, but the operator wanted to drill additional wells on. Also a centralized gathering facility and associated pipelines. The city in turn was able to negotiate regarding the location of the facilities, the timing of drilling wells, and the best management practices applicable to the facilities. One of the goals of the city was to ensure that pre-production activities at the Axis well sites and a suite of the Conoco well sites occurred prior to the drilling, prior to the time when the city anticipated significant residential development occurring. You can go to the next slide if you'd like. Thank you. Thus, the operator agreements required the drilling of certain wells to be complete within 5 years. Of the approximately 45 well sites that were operated by Conoco, 7 of the well sites were located less than 1,320 feet from the nearest residence. So the vast majority were located above, further than that distance. And notably, some of those wells that were within this buffer actually pre-existed the operator agreement, and they were included in the agreement because the operator simply wanted to add additional wells. But because they were included in the operator agreement, all of the more protective best management practices were applied to those existing facilities. In addition, the city secured dramatically stronger best management practices to protect water quality and air quality and to minimize nuisances. At the time the city entered into the negotiations, its oil and gas code was quite outdated, thereby providing minimal protections to residents and the environment. And so one of the goals, and in fact, one of the outcomes of the operator agreement process was to create a framework for future regulation. And that process has started, but it has not finished yet in the form of the current oil and gas ordinance, which hopefully will be finalized sometime this April, but we'll see. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the operator agreements contain significantly more protective environmental and nuisance best management practices. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. The following slides compare the best management practices with the state air quality and COGCC rules that were in effect at the time, and that was mid-2019. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the particularly significant best management practices in my opinion. And it's worth noting, of course, that the mission change rules significantly updated the COGCC rules that were in effect at the time that the operator agreements were finalized. And in addition, the Air Quality Control Commission has adopted more robust rules that also exceed some of the requirements that were included in the operator agreements. You can go to the next slide. In fact, yep, perfect. So these slides are based on the operator agreement with Axis, and that's because that was the first operator agreement that was negotiated, and the requirements in that agreement provided the framework for the subsequent agreement with ConocoPhillips. Axis agreed to use pipelines to transport all of the produced hydrocarbons and produced water from the well sites authorized by the operator agreement. However, they had an existing well site that was not yet fully connected to pipeline. Thus, the operator agreement required different, more stringent air quality requirements for the well sites that did not have pipelines, so-called tankless sites, because permanent tanks are not necessary at production facilities where all fluids and gases are piped off-site. For example, continuous air quality monitoring during both the pre-production phase and production are required at the facilities that have permanent tanks. Whereas just more frequent leak detection and repair inspections are required at the facilities that are tankless. In addition to requiring tankless production facilities for the 4 new well sites, the Axis OA also requires electric drill rigs and electrified production facilities, as well as some of the other things on this slide. Next slide, please. In terms of water protection, as I mentioned, protecting groundwater is a very significant priority for the city. And so the operator agreements contained a number of best management practices to protect the quality and quantity of groundwater in the city, as well as the infrastructure that's used to transport the groundwater. Some of the key requirements that I would just highlight would be a requirement that an operator drill a monitoring well if there's no available water source at the well site. Also, more frequent post-stimulation groundwater sampling than was required and then actually still is currently required by the current COGCC rules. A more comprehensive suite of analytes for which that water must be tested, and a requirement that if the monitoring detects any degradation of groundwater, then the operator needs to mitigate that groundwater back to baseline levels. Next slides, please. I'm actually just going to skip through these. There's a bunch more slides, so you can keep going, Angelica, if you don't mind. Yep, keep going. So there's a number of keep going. Perfect. Just back to the last one. That's great. So the slides contain a number of information on additional nuisance requirements that at the time exceeded COGCC requirements. As I mentioned, the mission change rulemaking significantly updated and strengthened the COGCC's rules. And so interestingly, a number of the requirements that were contained in the operator agreements are now found in some of the COGCC rules. But if folks are interested, those requirements in the OA are contained in the slide deck. So in addition to entering into an operator agreement with Axis to regulate and ConocoPhillips to require best management practices at well sites, the city also entered into an operator agreement with Elevations Midstream, and that authorized the construction of a centralized gathering facility, as well as associated facilities like a compressor station, for example, as well as pipelines. And both the midstream operator agreement and the 2 well site operator agreements form the basis, both in terms of process and in terms of substantive requirements for the ordinance, which is currently in the process of being drafted. You can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of process for the upstream permit, The Oil and Gas Division is responsible for administratively reviewing and approving the permit to ensure that it conforms with the requirements in the ordinance. The ordinance provides for a two-step process. The first is review and approval of a location. And then following this, the operator may submit additional requirements, such as, for example, any required final road use maintenance or water supply plans. And the Oil and Gas Division first administratively approves of a location. Following that, the Planning and Zoning Commission holds a public hearing. The Planning and Zoning Commission approves of the location, or may approve of the location, may approve of the location with conditions, may deny the location, or may remand the location back to the Oil and Gas Division for further review. The permit with respect to both the final permit and the decision with respect to the location don't automatically go to City Council. However, the City Council can request a hearing on any permit. The ordinance does not contain any setbacks from homes. So the operator agreements did not contain a setback from residential. Rather, the location of the facilities was part of the operator agreement negotiation process. In terms of the ordinance, though, the city will review the proposed locations pursuant to specified criteria, including to ensure that the location is compatible with any approved master plan or comprehensive plan, and that the location protects and minimizes adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. In addition, the operator must submit an alternative location if it's required to do so by the COGCC, or if the oil and gas manager so requires. The ordinance does contain some setbacks from sensitive environmental areas, in particular to protect groundwater. So there is a 1 mile setback from reservoirs. There is a 350-foot setback from domestic water wells and critical infrastructure. That's the underground infrastructure that transports the city's potable water. And there's also a 500-foot setback from floodplains. As far as I know, the city is one of the first to permit midstream facilities and to have robust requirements to address the siting of pipelines, as well as to reduce impacts from pipelines. Local governments are somewhat limited in their authority to regulate the safety, specifically of federally regulated pipelines, which predominantly are gathering lines in the city of Aurora. And this is due to federal preemption issues. However, that's not the case with respect to regulating the location of pipelines, including gathering lines, nor is it the case for regulating the safety of the flow lines and crude oil transfer lines that the COGCC regulates. So in the ordinance, the city has required additional safety provisions for flow lines, such as semi-annual aerial surveys for leaks, pressure testing, and pigging. And for pipelines regulated by PHMSA or the PUC, the midstream permit contains a number of siting requirements intended to ensure the compatibility between the location of the oil and gas pipelines and other subsurface infrastructure, as well as surface infrastructure, and also to protect sensitive environmental areas and homes in the event of a pipeline rupture or spill. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that presentation. This time I'm looking to commissioners if anyone has questions. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wow, so different. Thank you for the presentation. So again, I'm just going to ask everybody kind of how reverse setbacks work, and I assume then that would be addressed in the operator agreements. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like and how that process gets worked through related to, I'm just going to go to some of Commissioner Gonzalez's questions related to zoning and platting and what comes first and how close things are allowed to get if the permit to drill comes first, etc.
Sure. So I'm happy to answer that question. So as the chair noted initially, I do represent a number of other local governments, and some of those are, I would say Aurora and the city and county of Broomfield are both looking into establishing reverse setbacks. As far as I know, so in the operator agreements, we did not establish any reverse setbacks. And the current oil and gas ordinance also does not establish reverse setbacks. That is an issue that the city of Aurora is looking into, but it's not part of this ordinance. City and County of Broomfield similarly has an operator agreement, has current draft regulations. They do actually have a reverse setback. I believe it is only 250 feet in the current ordinance. However, there's a notice requirement wherein the residential developer does have to send a notice to persons. I think it might be up to 1,200 feet or 1,000 feet if there is a oil and gas location within that zone. Now I think I'm confusing things in terms of how the notice works, but that is an issue. Certainly the actual distance of the setback, so how close a residential home can be built to an existing oil and gas facility, is something that the City and County of Broomfield is actively looking into, and I know there's interest in making that setback larger. I did look into how many other local governments, at least on the Front Range, have reverse setbacks already on the books, and if I recall correctly, City of Fort Collins, Commerce City, who else has a reverse setback? I can't remember now, but at least those two, in addition to Broomfield, do have them on the books. I think Commerce City has recently updated theirs, and I can't remember the distance, but it's certainly, you know, something that a bunch of local governments are looking into and wanting to expand it beyond something like 200 feet, which sort of seems 200 to 500 is the norm with the current rules. And certainly there's interest, I think, in going as far as 2,000 feet. But as Greg Dean mentioned, I do think that creates some problems in terms of restricting, you know, residential development.
Follow up, Commissioner McGowan? You're good. Okay. Elizabeth, if you could, and I know the answer to this question because I used to be a local government lawyer, but can you sort of describe for our stakeholders, we've got like 80 people listening in, the historic use of operator agreements, why that was done. There's a little question about public involvement in that. And then what your perspective is with the enactment of SB 19-181 and going forward, whether you sort of see operator agreements continuing to be used versus, you know, sort of use of the regulatory authority that has been presented by SB 19-181. I think that would be a good sort of topic for your illumination.
Sure, thanks for that question. So prior to the passage of SB 19-181, local governments were quite constrained with respect to their ability to regulate both the location of oil and gas facilities and to apply any kind of protections for public health, safety, the environment, wildlife, or welfare because of state statute and interpretations by the Supreme Court of Colorado of that statute. And so basically, a number of local governments who really wanted to regulate oil and gas facilities more and more protectively entered into operator agreements. And basically that allowed the local governments to negotiate. And so they weren't necessarily requiring, pursuant to ordinance, operators to comply with any specific best management practices or siting requirements. Rather, it was a negotiation at the end of which there was a contract, and pursuant to that contract, the operator was bound to comply with the contract provisions. And so operator agreements took the world of local government regulation of oil and gas out of the realm of ordinance, traditional rulemaking regulation into the contract world that provided different types of remedies, contract remedies specifically. And it also basically authorized the imposition of more stringent requirements to protect public health and the environment than local governments otherwise could have imposed on the operators. Certainly, those negotiations were not done in public. However, the various operator agreements, at least the City of County of Broomfield, the City of Aurora, once the the cities had negotiated with the oil and gas companies and sort of gotten to essentially a final deal. That deal was taken in both instances to City Council, both in study sessions and then additional meetings that were public meetings, and both entities did receive significant public comment as well as the opportunity for City Council to comment. So there was a public participation aspect in terms of the final review and finalization of those operator agreements, similar, quite honestly, to what happens when an oil and gas, when a local government revises its rules, or when any agency revises its rules. Usually there's internal revision and drafting by staff, followed by public comment and a public hearing. And then subsequently there's the opportunity for the staff and the decision makers to review the rules or the contract to reflect public input. I would say that at this point, given the much the broader authority that oil and gas, sorry, I keep saying that, the broader authority that local governments have to regulate oil and gas development, there is a much lesser need for operator agreements. In fact, most of my clients that traditionally utilize them are no longer even allowing for the use of operator agreements. So City and County of Broomfield, for example, I would not anticipate that they would be utilized as much, at least for the regulation of upstream facilities that are subject to the COGCC jurisdiction. I could potentially imagine local governments still using operator agreements to negotiate with pipeline operators, since there is a greater risk of federal and state preemption with respect to the regulation of safety of pipelines. However, there may even be some legal challenges in terms of using operator agreements to impose more stringent safety requirements on pipelines and pipeline facilities.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. I think that's helpful for all of our listeners, and appreciate that dichotomy that exists now. Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Paranos. That was actually, it was good to see the comparison between Adams County and Aurora and some of the other communities that you represent. So as these operate, well, two things. So I know that you've got the operator agreements and now you've got the ordinance, and I'm talking specifically about the city of Aurora, although certainly if this applies to other areas, I'd be curious about that too. But is existing zoning contemplated in those as far as where allowable uses for oil and gas operations can be? And if so, what are those zoning areas that it is allowed?
Great question. So the city of Aurora hasn't currently utilized its zoning authority to restrict oil and gas development in any particular area, similar to how it hasn't adopted a setback. Each location will be reviewed by the oil and gas manager and planning and zoning and potentially city council to make sure it conforms with the planned development master plan and comprehensive area plan for the city. City and County of Broomfield did adopt both the 2,000-foot setback and revised its zoning ordinance last year. So currently, oil and gas development is only allowed in, I believe it's industrial, light industrial, and in the aviation zoned area. I know that other jurisdictions, including Erie and Boulder County, also revised their zoning ordinances to similarly restrict, basically prohibit oil and gas development in residential areas and limit it to industrial, light industrial areas. And I believe the city of Lafayette is going to follow suit in a similar fashion.
Thanks. One other question, I think, in regards to the reverse setbacks, I thought it was interesting that Adams County, again, is contemplating what reverse setbacks are, and they'll have discussions about that. And it sounds like there will be a differentiation between reverse setbacks required for perhaps, existing permitted locations that have not been drilled and existing locations that are already in production stage, so have already had the pre-production and completion stages done. Do you see any of the municipalities that you represent perhaps looking at that distinction?
So I would say we're still in the early phase. Some of my clients, other clients like Lafayette and City and County Broomfield, in terms of either revising or adopting. So revising in the case of Broomfield, adopting in the case of Lafayette, a reverse setback. I certainly think there is a logical distinction between pre-production activities and production facilities, especially where you have a production facility that's tankless, so no permanent tanks, much less traffic associated with those facilities, significantly less air emissions. So I certainly think it's a relevant factor to be considered when crafting a reverse setback.
Thanks. And I lied. I have one more question, if that's okay, Mr. Chair. So I'd asked Mr. Dean about the relationship between counties and municipalities within the county, and I'd be curious to see or get your thoughts on that as well, since you represent a number of municipalities, as far as how that relationship works between the municipalities and the counties. And do you utilize IGAs or 3-mile plans, or more individual type of negotiations with your neighbors?
So mostly, I would say at this point, it's mostly just ad hoc negotiations. I would say there is a significant interest in working with one's neighbors. And so, for example, the city of Lafayette is in the process of revising its oil and gas ordinance, and it really wants to track very closely to the requirements that the Boulder County adopted. So there would essentially be close to complete parity, although there'll be some differences. So that's one example of really wanting to track closely to what the county has done. I'd say City of Broomfield, City and County of Broomfield, City of Westminster. Actually, the City of Westminster is in the process of also adopting an ordinance that is modeled on the City and County of Broomfield's ordinance. So again, this desire to make requirements as the same or very similar. And I guess I would say that, the recent COGCC mission change rulemakings really enable that kind of coordination, because now there's just a greater opportunity for, at the state level, the proximate local government to weigh in and help with permitting, make sure that its concerns are addressed at the state level. I think that kind of coordination at the state level helps provide for greater coordination at the local level.
All right, thank you very much.
Other questions from commissioners? All right, I'm not seeing any. Thank you, Elizabeth, for taking time this morning and presenting to us. Very helpful as we undertake sort of our additional informational dockets and as we learn about the various approaches local governments are using. Let's take a short break. It's 10:53. Let's come back at, say, 11 o'clock, and we will hear from David Baumgarten, the former Gunnison County attorney, and then Jason Maxey, the Weld County Oil and Gas Director, in that order. So we'll see you in about 7 minutes. Hey folks, 11 o'clock. I see folks are rejoining us. Good to see everybody. Hearings Manager Amaro, we'll continue with our agenda, and I think we have former Gunnison County Attorney David Baumgarten available for us. If we could bring him to the floor.
Good morning.
Good morning, David.
So, Mr. Chair, good morning, directors and others. And thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation and answer questions you may have from an historic perspective. A brief introduction of me. From 1989 through the beginning of this year, I was the county attorney for Gunnison County on the Western Slope. And I think I am the only Western Slope person making a presentation today. My own background may be of interest to you because together with Barbara Green, we were primarily responsible to draft Gunnison County's regulations almost 20 years ago. My own background includes a bachelor's degree in 1970 from the University of California, Berkeley, a Juris Doctor from the University of Colorado School of Law in 1973, and a master's in education from Harvard University in 1978. I'm admitted to the practice of law in Colorado, Massachusetts, and New York. Other seminal experiences have included being a public defender in Brooklyn in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a solo law practice in Boulder for a number of years, and some 35 plus years of training in martial arts, where I have concluded that sometimes a diplomatic stepping aside and preserving my opportunity to strike is as effective as a frontal kick or a punch in resolving disputes. I think it's prudent and essential for me to begin, as lawyers sometimes do, with some disclaimers. Disclaimer number one, I do not currently or officially speak for the Board of County Commissioners of Denison County. I'm making this presentation privately as an ex-county attorney. Disclaimer two, or maybe better put, some thank yous. I have had over the last 25 plus years professional dealings with iterations of the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, its directors, commissioners, and staff, both as a county attorney and in the capacity as the county's local government designee. And I have found them, you and your lineage, to be accessible, attentive, professional, competent, and ethical, even when issues were contentious and litigious. Among the people who I hold in this esteem are David Neslin, Matt Lepore, Julie Murphy, Jeff Robbins, Howard Boygan, John Mesner, Dave Kubesco, and Joel Miner, to name a few. Disclaimer number three is that my presentation is not only based on my experiences as the Gunnison County attorney, but also myself having been a commissioner for 2 terms on the Colorado Water Quality Control Commission, during which time I was a liaison with your commission. All of which is to say, I know and appreciate the consequential work we all do as state and local governments, the enormity of crafting and implementing state and local government rules and regulations, the opportunities available for state and willing local governments to work together, and the sometimes glacial, stepwise labor required to obtain those collegial relationships and trust. So, what has Gunnison County done regarding regulation of oil and gas? The first question would be, when did we first initiate our own regulation? The Board of County Commissioners first adopted regulations for oil and gas regulations by Gunnison County by our resolution 2003-50 on May 9th, 2003. These regulations were amended in 2004, 2007, 2010, and 12. And I expect, given Senate Bill 19-181, after some dust has settled, will be further amended. Why did Gunnison County adopt oil and gas regulations? First, consider our location. While most of Gunnison County is along Highway 50 corridor, the northern portion is on the road from Carbondale over McClure Pass towards Delta. And considering the location of oil and gas fields, that portion of Gunnison County is at the southeast bottom corner of the Piceance Basin, where it appeared activity would be increasing. Second, while Gunnison County has and has had robust land use regulations, oil and gas activities are different than, say, subdivision and house building. Third, although we have no large human population centers in that quadrant of our county, we do have unincorporated Somerset, much U.S. Forest Service lands, Paonia Reservoir, and the headwaters of the North Fork of the Gunnison River, which feeds directly into the Colorado River. So the why rationale, following our then political, social, and legal frameworks, was, quote, to provide reasonable limitations and safeguards to the exploration and production of oil and gas resources in the county in a manner that conserves other natural resources, that is sensitive to surrounding land uses, and that mitigates adverse impacts to and protects the public health, safety, welfare, and the environment of Gunnison County. How did we do it? Our legal authorities were, among others, two series of statutes. One is Colorado Revised Statute 29-2101 at SEC, which is the Local Government Land Use Control Enabling Act of 1974. And the second was CRS 3028-101 at SEC and 201 at SEC, which are county planning and building codes. The subject matters we initially regulated were surface land use impacts and components, including drainage and erosion control, access roads, public roadway and traffic impacts, impacts to wildlife habitat and wildlife, impacts to livestock and livestock grazing, impacts on recreation, impacts to water body quality, impacts to well and public water supply, buffers from water bodies, including a non-waivable, impenetrable buffer of 150 feet from surface water bodies, and a buffer extending 500 feet from surface water bodies in which only limited oil and gas activity could occur. Pits, management of hazardous materials, response and reporting of spills and releases, protection of cultural and historic resources, wildlife hazards, geologic hazards, emergency response, impact mitigation costs, but perhaps most importantly, Gunnison County regulates not only on private surface lands, but also on federal surface lands. Approval standards are a mixture of narrative or performance standards and metrics, that is, numbers, very much like your own. What happened next? Well, there was a lawsuit. The county sued one oil and gas entity seeking to enjoin that entity from drilling or maintaining wells on federal property within Gunnison County and seeking an order requiring that entity to comply with the county's oil and gas regulations. The COGCC moved to intervene in that case on behalf of the operator and was allowed to do so by the court to challenge the county's regulatory authority. The trial court issued a summary judgment, finding that certain portions of the county's regulations were preempted by state law and COGCC requirements. The county appealed to the Colorado Court of Appeals, and one can find that decision in case number 04 CA 1679. The citation is a 159 Pacific 3rd 773, Colorado Appellate Court, 2006. In short, while the Court of Appeals held that certain of Gunnison County's regulations, for instance, concerning fines or financial guarantees or access to operator records, were invalid, the court declined to uphold the trial court's invalidation of many other county requirements, including those affecting water quality, soil erosion, wildlife and vegetation, livestock, geologic hazards, cultural and historic resources, wildfire protection, impacts on recreation, and permit duration. Finding that the trial court did not have sufficient evidence on the record to invalidate them. But perhaps most importantly for those local governments whose jurisdiction contains federal lands, the Court of Appeals concluded, quote, neither the federal statutory scheme nor the case law relied upon by the intervening oil and gas entity supports the conclusion that Congress intended to preempt all local regulation in the area of oil and gas operations, end quote, on federal lands. There was no further appeal, nor were there further trial court proceedings. Gunnison County has since processed and issued, by my informal count, between 80 and 100 oil and gas operation permits, including many by that operator who was involved in the lawsuit. That is, Gunnison County has continued to regulate oil and gas operations regarding those subjects not found to be invalid by the Court of Appeals and regarding operations on federal land. So what are my takeaways? The first is that pre-Senate Bill 19181, local governments actually did have authority, albeit imprecisely defined and subject to challenge. 2, Gunnison County relied on that authority successfully, although not on all subjects we intended. 3, yes, there is local government land use authority regarding surface impacts of oil and gas operations on federal lands. And 4, Senate Bill 19181 has solidified those authorities. And in addition, has created opportunities for the state and local government and the federal government, if it were to choose to do so, to intentionally, and I trust collegially, coordinate their regulatory efforts. So recognizing that we, meaning local governments, and you, have at least 9 audiences. For myself, it's my Board of County Commissioners, my own community development staff, the industry, potentially impacted population, the population as a whole, the federal government, you, the COGCC, the legislature, and of course the courts. How do we proceed post-19181? I expect that Gunnison County will review and revise its regulations and perhaps reestablish what the trial court decision removed. My modest suggestions would include these. The first would be education. And I'm pleased to hear that there is that bi-weekly session that you all are conducting with local governments about our various authorities and relationships with each other. The second would be cooperation, even coordination, trustfully, collegially, regarding permitting, regulation, inspection, and enforcement, knowing that local governments are sometimes strapped for staff, money, and experience. This could include information sharing, informal sequencing of permitting, formal sequencing of permitting, expansion of the use of intergovernmental agreements, and the step aside that I learned decades ago in martial arts. Are there other areas where we could consider cooperating to augment our resources? I can think of 2. One would be in the area of inspections, where local government really may lack some of the technical expertise. And I remember historically asking the COGC inspectors how frequently they inspected wells in Gunnison County, and the answer was every 2 years. A second area where I think we could augment our resources would be dispute resolution. Dispute resolution, because an informed participatory solution is better than a litigated one, and perhaps a COGC-sponsored ombudsman program would be of assistance. And please, I'm open to your questions.
Thank you, David, for the presentation. Appreciate the historic perspective that you bring to this commission and your information that you have there. Speaking to that last little piece, you mentioned two areas where the commission and local governments might continue to work well together with the inspections and then dispute resolution. What do you mean with regard to the dispute resolution piece?
We have not had a large amount of unhappy Gunnison County citizens. The area where we've got oil and gas is really unpopulated federal land. But I see on the Front Range vehement opposition in some cases and disagreement. And it may be that the use of an ombudsman just to air out those solutions, those contentions, and come up with possible solutions would be a mechanism to take the heat off a little bit of the conversation.
And David, I know you and I had this discussion back when I was director of the commission about the concept of an ombudsman. Would you provide a little more perspective on your thought on that? And I know it's something that we've talked about, but we've not engaged in yet, but I think it is a good idea, and I appreciate your perspective.
An ombudsman is a third-party neutral, for lack of better words, a mediator or a facilitator who can taxi back and forth between parties in dispute, really listen carefully and translate to the other disputants different perspectives and offer potential solutions, and hopefully avoid a more formal, contentious process.
Excellent, thank you for that. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, David. It's good to see you. It's been too long.
And yourself.
So having had the opportunity to work with Mr. Baumgarten, on lots of different things, but I think perhaps if you would go into a little more detail around the land use regulation process that Gunnison County utilizes, because I think it is unique to some of the other presenters that we had today, where you've got the difference between performance-based land use decision-making and Euclidean zoning. And some communities, are more on one side than the other. Some communities have some hybrid of those two. But I do think, having a better understanding of what a performance-based land use process looks like, which in a lot of ways is something that we developed that the Oil and Gas Commission utilizes and has refined through the mission change rulemaking.
First, I think would be the extraordinary difference between each side of the Continental Divide. I have been told that 90% of the people in Colorado live on the Front Range, but much of the resources are on the western slope. So we do not have the density of human population that the Front Range has. But yes, we do have natural resources. Gunnison County has not adopted Euclidean zoning, where one can go into a particular zone and perform an activity as of right. It is on an application by application basis. And there are some fairly strict rules about density. For instance, 1 residence per 1 acre. For each of those subjects that I have mentioned, they are mirrored in a separate document, the Gunnison County Land Use Resolution. And again, rather than a metric, we have used a narrative standard, avoid risk or create no significant adverse net impact as the standard for approval. Commissioner, does that answer the question?
Yeah, it certainly does. I imagine some of the other commissioners may have questions, and so I will defer to them at this point.
Commissioner Najapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Mr. Baumgarten, for the explanation. Just on that last point, I just wanted to better understand when you said that there's not the Euclidean zoning and it is determined case by case on application. So does that mean, yeah, I guess maybe just if you could elaborate a little bit further on how that works if somebody's coming in with a commercial development versus a oil and gas development, you know, versus something else. What sorts of criteria are evaluated in approving or denying?
So first, philosophically, we really try to keep like by like. In Gunnison County, there are only 2 municipalities that I think have some density, maybe 3, maybe 4. Crested Butte, the city of Gunnison, the town of Mount Crested Butte, and the town of Pitkin, which is a little further away. In between those municipalities is viable agricultural land, which we want to keep intact, and most importantly, on which we want to keep the water. And so we try to push development as close as we can to existing development, and we try to put like next to like. I would hesitate to say we do that on an ad hoc basis because somebody will put me on a witness stand and say that we're doing that on an ad hoc basis. But we really try to compare neighbor to neighbor so that growth happens in an organized rather than a hopscotch manner. Again, really remembering the difference between what the Front Range looks like and what the Western Slope looks like.
Thank you, Mr. Baumgarten. I had a separate question that was related to what you mentioned with the Court of Appeals decision with respect to federal lands. I couldn't scribble down fast enough what you read, and so I was wondering if you could read that one more time.
Oh, I would be pleased to. Allow me. It's going to just take me a second to get back to it. Court of Appeals said, quote, neither the federal statutory scheme nor the case law relied upon by, my parentheses, the intervening oil and gas entity, end quote, or in parentheses, supports the conclusion that Congress intended to preempt all oil and gas regulation, all local regulation in the area of oil and gas operations, end quote, on federal lands. Meaning, yes, we have the opportunity to do land use or surface impact regulation on federal land, but not technical downhole.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you very much. That clarifies. I think that's all I have right at the moment, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Baumgarten. I appreciate the presentation and a lot of the history and background there, so thank you very much. I've got a question that it's kind of been picking at me, and I'm going to inartfully pose it. But in general, you know, or at least from your experience, Mr. Baumgarten, you know, how do counties determine their preferences for what types of development they favor in their jurisdiction?
Well, you first let's start with two ends of a spectrum. There are some that want development and some that want no development. And then some that really want commercial, industrial, some that want recreation. So if we've got however many counties in the state, 56 or 62, each one really will have a very unique perspective. And sometimes the perspective will be diametrically opposite for counties that are adjacent to each other. For instance, Gunnison County has regulated oil and gas. Delta County, which is immediately downstream from us, has struggled for some number of years to choose whether to do so or not. And if they were to do so in a limited fashion. And so I don't know that there is a unified perspective. Indeed, one of the things that I was wondering whether to suggest was whether a model local government code could be created. And I decided that given the political differences, that would just be an impossibility. So you have every shade of regulation that one can imagine.
Commissioner Gonzalez, follow up.
Fair enough. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the answer.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, and acknowledging that you no longer represent Gunnison County, so I'm just asking for your opinion as an individual. I think for a long time, Gunnison County fought for its ability to have sequential permitting, which means that oil and gas operations must first receive a permit from the local government prior to receiving a permit from the COGCC. We've heard a lot of different opinions, particularly through mission change, as far as whether local governments may want sequential or concurrent permitting. What are your thoughts between the two, just in general, and why at one stage did you determine that sequential permitting was important?
I think at the stage that I wanted sequential was when we were in an adversarial position with the COGCC, and I just wanted to put a stake in the ground that we had our own independent authority. With the advent of 19181, my suggestion very strongly would be that it should start out together, and it should perhaps start out together as early as a pre-application conference between the local government and the COGCC, so that the local government, COGCC, and the operator can sit down together, review preliminary information, and the operator can get some preliminary feedback. I would like to share the expertise that the COGCC has that the local government may not. And I would like to share the land use, topographic, geographic, population information that the local government may have about itself that COGCC does not. If we were to start together at that point in a pre-application conference, then I think the processes can move independently, but rather concurrently. The next step would be who makes a decision first. And I think if the local government does a significantly robust amount of notification and information collection and analysis, then the COGCC may give that local government decision some deferential value. And so at that point, it may be sequential. That is, that the local government makes its decision first and sends that information on to the COGCC, who can make an independent determination if it wants more or if it is actually persuasive and ought to be given deference. So it's a hybrid, but I think very important to get COGCC involved in the beginning.
Thank you.
Looking around, I'm not seeing further questions at this time. Thank you again, Mr. Baumgarten, for providing us with a piece of your retirement time. Really appreciate it. I appreciate the perspective that you bring to this, and we'll look forward to continuing working with you on whatever comes next. So thank you very much.
It will be my pleasure. Thank you all.
All right, hearings manager Amaro, I believe we need to bring Jason Maxey from Weld County to the panel.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Hello, Mr. Maxey, can you hear us?
Yes, good morning, Chairman Robbins. How are you all doing?
We are great. Great to have you wrap up this local government presentation 101 for us this morning.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Just 1 second while I bring up the screen that I'm hoping to share. And hopefully you all are seeing that first slide.
We are.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation from Chairman Robbins and from the Commission to present to you all this morning about Weld County and our 1041 Weld Oil and Gas Location Assessment, or WOGLA, process. And I also just want to thank the other presenters this morning. Due to the fact that this started a little bit earlier than what was originally planned, there was a little bit of shuffling of the deck, so to speak. And so I appreciate the flexibility on both the Commission's side as well as the other presenters' side. So thank you very much for that. This morning, really the presentation that I'm going to give you all is a little bit of a two-part presentation, and be happy to answer any questions at the end as well for the Commission. But I want to talk about first our Weld County Department and the department overview. And then I want to get into some of the process at a high level for what we do on a day-to-day basis here in Weld County. So to start, going to go over the staff of the department. So along with myself, you can see that we also have 5 permit and enforcement specialists who are oil and gas employees for the county, and 2 office technicians. We also have a full-time hearing officer, 2 public works employees who are dedicated to the oil and gas department, along with 1 environmental health employee who is dedicated to the department as well. And what I'd like to just mention on this slide is that even though there's not really a true division between the left and right side of this slide right here, there is a division, so to speak. All of these people listed on this slide do not report directly to me. The hearing officer in particular reports directly to the Board of County Commissioners. He is their appointee and reports to them. As mentioned, to 2 other departments, both Public Works and Environmental Health, have employees located and dedicated to oil and gas development and review of permits and enforcement actions within the county, but those employees report directly to that particular department. And I think what this does, and hopefully what this shows, is that this department was set up very mindfully when we were looking at oversight and overview, and it provides accountability and a certain amount of checks and balances for our process, which I believe is a very good thing. So the department was created by the Board of County Commissioners on July 8th, 2019, and we officially opened our doors on August 5th, 2019. And this firmly establishes local control over mineral resources in unincorporated Weld County, which, as you all know, was part of Senate Bill 181. And our department is responsible for permitting, regulating, and enforcing surface regulations related to oil and gas locations. Similar to what I heard earlier on today in another presentation, we don't have any type of permitting for downhole development, which would have been your Form 2 process, or any of the monitoring or inspections or anything like that for downhole development. But we do regulate and permit the surface location. And again, we are staffed with 12 employees that are responsible for that enforcement, for that permitting authority of county regulations, which will ensure health, safety, welfare for the public and the environment. So our new 1041 Weld Oil and Gas Location Assessment, or again, WOGLA for an acronym, it's in Chapter 21, Article 5 of the Weld County Code. It was effective the date that we opened our doors, so August 5th, 2019. And we've actually already gone through a revision of that chapter and that article. And that revision had, I would say, substantial changes based on basically a year of being open at that time and processing permits and seeing changes that needed to be implemented. And so that revised code became effective August 17th of 2020. What we do is we take a comprehensive look at all proposed oil and gas locations. It doesn't matter if it's one well or multi-well, it's every location that is proposing development. We take a look at that through the 1041 process. Again, health, safety, welfare of the public and environment is very crucial, but also compatibility, cumulative impacts, and siting analysis is a huge part of our process overall. And I'll get into that a little bit more throughout the presentation. Our applications are reviewed by staff, and then a formal order is given by our hearing officer. So a little bit more detail before I switch from this slide. I wanted to give a little bit more kind of stats and information. Prior to August 5th, 2019, we did have just what I'll call the old WOGLA code, which was under our planning department code, Chapter 23. And so there was a permitting process for oil and gas locations, in fact, which I was a part of because I was a part of the planning department at that time. And it was underneath that chapter of Weld County Code. But even prior to that, there is a planning process called a use by special review permit, or a USR process. And there were oil and gas locations, especially the larger multi-well locations that we started seeing around 2008 and after that, that went through USR processes. And there's multiple locations that went through that process through the planning department up until 2017, when the WOGLA rules came into play. And then obviously we had the change in mid-2019 going to the 1041 WOGLA code. Our department, oil and gas department, also handles large pipelines. So any natural gas pipelines 12 inches or greater, or petroleum pipelines 13 inches or greater, go through a separate permitting process, which our department handles as well. And compressor stations and processing facilities, I heard those mentioned earlier on today as well. They go through a planning process, that USR process that I just mentioned. So those are handled as well through the county, but in a different department. Just some very quick stats for you all, just so that you know the level of development in Weld County. Under just strictly the old WOGLA process, so 2017 until basically mid-2019, when the new 1041 process took effect, under that old WOGLA code, we processed approximately 500 locations. Under the new 1041 WOGLA code, and when this department was formed, up until today, we've processed approximately 83 that have either already gone through the process or are pending right now, pending hearings. So there's about 83 of those that we have reviewed. Regarding active wells in Weld County, I think it's interesting for you all to know right now, currently, I just looked this morning, the daily activity dashboard on the COGCC website, there's approximately 50,500 active status wells in Colorado. 19,000 of which are in Weld County. So we have about 38% of all active wells in Colorado. If you look at production in 2020, the state of Colorado had 171,500,000 approximately barrels of oil equivalent that were produced in the state of Colorado. Of that, Weld County had a little over 149 million. So we account for about 87% of the oil production within the state of Colorado. Wanted to make sure I mentioned those stats before we go on any further, which plays into why our department is set up the way it is, why we have the staffing levels the way that we have them right now to handle oil and gas development within the county. I'd like to now get into some of the multi-agency coordination and cooperation aspects and a little bit more of how we process oil and gas permits within Weld County. And it starts with, in my opinion, a multi-step, multi-agency planning process, which needs to consider land use proposals along with also comprehensively considering other land use items. And if we don't do that, then that's, in my opinion, a fundamental misstep of land use overall. And there's no entity better suited to handle land use items than local governments. You've heard a lot of different local governments today and that they have different processes, whether it's USRs or WOGLAs or other permitting processes for oil and gas or residential types of development. And this is something that we do day in and day out, land use. And so we need to look comprehensively at land use and not just look at one type of land use. If that's just oil and gas, we can't just look at oil and gas. If it's residential or commercial or industrial, we can't just look at that. We have to consider road developments as well. We have to consider compatibility issues with other surrounding land uses. We have to consider agriculture. In the case of Weld County, agriculture is a huge impact to our economy and the state's economy as well. So we have to look at it from a very comprehensive standpoint. Along with that, though, I think Weld County and a lot of other jurisdictions within the state would also fully acknowledge and in some cases defer to state permitting processes. And some examples of that just with oil and gas in particular are DSU applications, of which Weld County has really no part in. That's a COGCC process. And then the new air monitoring permits that have come out from the CDPHE. While we review those, that is nothing that is written into our rules at this current point. We appreciate being a part of that review, but that is one thing that we defer to the state permitting process on. However, there is, in my opinion, there's a need for coordination of processes, cooperation, and communication. And that is what I believe our WOGLA process is built upon, as you will see here in just a minute. And what this leads to is efficient, effective government. And as a taxpayer, I think that I hope I can speak for a lot of people that are either listening or on the commission that we should all appreciate efficient and effective government. And that is what the goal is, at least my goal is for our department, is to be efficient and effective along with our other entities that we work with. So what are the Weld County steps? I'm going to go through 4 steps at again, hopefully a high level with a little bit of ad lib in between the slides. And try to hit what I think are the biggest points of our process and the most critical points. So number 1 is the pre-application meeting. And the last time I was in front of you all was back during rulemaking back in September, I believe. And we hit on this. And the pre-application meeting is a part of every single application that we get. And even Mr. Baumgarten just a few minutes ago agreed that this is essential to the process. And so, before I even heard him say that, part of my slide was this is definitely vital to the process, this pre-application meeting. We include the COGCC on all requests. There's no caveat to that as far as if this, then that, and we exclude you all. We include the COGCC in every single pre-application meeting request and invitation that we have. And we have the ability and flexibility to include other entities if necessary. For example, Colorado Parks and Wildlife have been a part of multiple pre-application meetings for the last few months. Municipalities or other counties are also included if deemed necessary, if they're within a certain distance from the location. And we feel like they need to be included, then we want to include any and all of those agencies or entities that we need to in order to have a comprehensive pre-application meeting. And what the goal is from this pre-application meeting is to give the applicant kind of an initial thumbs up or thumbs down about should they move forward with their preferred location and move forward through the other processes. Because if we don't do that, then how would the applicant know if they should expend further time and resources on moving forward with the application process, whether that's with Weld County or whether that's with the state? They have to have an idea about if they should move forward or not. Just to, again, expand on this a little bit, I use the word vital to the planning process, but that's a tough word to say, and it's probably not a strong enough word to describe how important this step is. This is the time for the operators and all other necessary entities to come together and discuss the proposal. And at the base level, this is planning. When we talk about land use and a planning process and a review of an application, this is planning. You can't move forward without having a process like this and a step like this. In Weld County Code, we have the word site analysis, and in COGCC rules, you all use the term alternate location analysis. So whichever one we use, that is a planning tool. And the time to use that tool is not once you get an application. That time to use that tool starts right now with the pre-application phase to start going over those other siting analysis or other ALA criteria that you have gone through to justify, again, your preferred location and the ability to move forward throughout the rest of the permitting process. Collaboration and cooperation, again, I mentioned it earlier, but that is among the various entities is crucial at this point. We have to have meaningful participation at this stage of the game in order to effectively move forward with the process. And in my opinion, if there is robust planning prior to the applications being filed, it makes the application and then the post-application process more streamlined for everybody. So, again, this is a vital step of our process. We include the COGCC, and we look forward to working with you all on future requests that come before Weld County. The second step is the 1041 Wogeland notice. Now, this is an applicant requirement. So whereas we coordinate the pre-app meeting, the applicant requests that we hold a meeting, but Weld County coordinates that meeting, and we handle the invitations. At step number 2, this is an applicant requirement. And this is something that is either emailed or mailed out, depending on who they're sending it to. So for Weld County, they email it to us. But if it's a homeowner or a property owner, this could get mailed to them. But it's not only sent to just building units. I think that's important to note. In our process, we also send this to property owners. This is the second phase of the game that the COGCC gets involved, because you all receive the 1041 Wogeland notice as well. The CPW is a required notice party. And again, if there's any other entities that need to require notification, then we stipulate that as well. For example, if a school district is within the WOGLA zone, then a school district would get notification at this stage of the game, along with an adjoining county or an adjoining municipality if they're within a certain distance from the location. Now, this notice has to be sent out no more than 6 months or no less than 30 days prior to the application being submitted to Weld County. What this does is it keeps this process fresh, so to speak. We don't get a notice and a pre-application meeting that has been hanging out there for a year and a half. This requirement means that if they don't submit their formal application within this time period, that it expires, and that operator has to start all over again with a brand new pre-application meeting, a brand new notice in order to move through the process. Moving on to step 3, the next major step would actually be the 1041 WOGLA application. So this is the formal submittal along with all supporting documentation for the preferred location. The notice of hearing that Weld County does, that notice of hearing is sent out at least 37 days prior to hearing. There's legal notice sent to the newspaper, and it's published, obviously. A formal request is sent to multiple agencies as well. So we send formal referral requests to other Weld County departments, to the COGCC, CDPHE, CPW, school districts, multiple other entities, again, site determined based on site determination, but we send it out to multiple entities. Now, this is a referral request, which is different than the notice of hearing. The notice of hearing is sent out, again, to the affected surrounding property owners or any building unit owners that are around the location. So just like the prior step of the 1041 Wogeland notice that was sent out by the operator, we as the county then send out notification of hearing to those same entities along with these agencies that are listed here. And then leading up to the next step, staff prepares a report with a recommendation to our hearing officer in preparation of that hearing. So I again want to hit on the fact that we talked about participation in the pre-app meeting, but this is another very critical step of the game to where we want to make sure that we get meaningful participation and referrals returned to Weld County. The referrals that we sent out are intended to provide our staff and our hearing officer with critical information, which plays into the questions that are asked and plays into the determination that our staff makes in their recommendation to our hearing officer. And if we don't receive comments back from our referral agencies, if they're not substantial, then it really is hard to have those play into the determination for this location. And this is the third step for the COGCC as well. So again, we're kind of leading up to multiple different milestones of interaction between our two agencies. And this is the third step along the line that you are absolutely included in. And so the hope is that at this time, some of the comments that are received back from the COGCC would be very much like BMPs that might be needed to be considered, or additional conditions of approval, COAs, that might need to be recommended. Because at this stage, we've had a lot of interaction with you all, hopefully, with the operator. We've had our pre-app meeting, we've had the 1041 notice, and we're building up to this point to the hearing, which is the next step. And that referral back from the COGCC would hopefully, again, solidify some things in our staff's mind and in their recommendation, and the hearing officer as well, that we could consider during that time and include in the final order that the hearing officer writes and sends out after the fact. Step number 4 is the 1041 WOGLA hearing. We hold those in person, but we also do a remote option. Obviously, last year, with COVID kind of starting in March and happening, that changed a lot of things, but we reacted pretty quickly, and within a month, after putting a couple cases on hold, in mid-April, we were able to implement a online virtual hearing process as well. But now that we're further along through that pandemic, we do hold our hearings in person, but we still maintain a remote option. So for any entity such as yourself or CPW or CDPHE that wants to attend and just listen in on those hearings, there is that option for you to observe, along with anybody else that wishes to as well. At these hearings, our staff and the applicant give presentations to the hearing officer. We do have a process and a term in our code called intervention. And if there are any intervention parties to a case, then they are given time to testify. This is a public meeting, meaning that anybody in the public or any agency can attend the meeting. But if you're requesting to testify, then we do have a code required process that allows for the hearing officer to view and to approve or deny an intervention request into the hearing if there is an affected party. So that's important to note as well, that it is a public meeting, but again, if you're requesting to testify, we have a process for that. And then at the end of the hearing, even though there's some various options for what the hearing officer can do, he can obviously approve, deny, continue. There's multiple things that could happen. But at the end of a hearing, there will be an order that is given. To a certain extent, there's going to be a final order given. And what this order does is it details the case. It details all the findings of fact that were presented during that hearing. And it also details any additional conditions of approval or standards that need to be upheld. And again, that goes back to the prior step about those referral comments coming in so that our staff can consider those as a part of their staff report and recommendation to the hearing officer. After the hearing, though, and after a final order is given, usually granting approval, but also there could be a denial or continuance. But for approval cases, there are legal notices that need to be sent to the paper and published. And then that final order is recorded with the Weld County Clerk and Recorder as well. Our permits are good for 3 years. So I heard Adams County say that as well. So our 1041 WOGLA permits are good for 3 years. But just a couple quick other side notes for this step of the process. Adams County has a very robust permitting process, and hopefully look forward to working a little bit more with Greg Dean on that, and especially since our two counties border each other. But I do want to say that unlike Adams County, where they talked about their process and being administrative and being elevated to their board if needed, I do want to highlight that every single application for a 1041 WOGLA goes before our hearing officer. It follows this process that we just went through, but every single one goes before the hearing officer. Now, we do have a sundry process or an amendment process, if you want to use a different term. And that amendment process is used to determine, do we have a major change to a permit or a minor change to a permit? Now that starts off as an administrative process that could get elevated to a full-blown permit if need be, if it's a major change, or that sundry could get administratively approved, excuse me. But regardless, that is the only process right now that is administratively approved if it meets the minor requirements. But every 1041 WOGLA application goes to hearing. And also, I do want to say, similar to Adams County, just for the commission's benefit, we have always measured from the edge of disturbance to include temporary topsoil staging or MLVT areas, not just the working pad surface. So inherently, our buffer around what we review always goes from the disturbance area, and it always has. That's even pre-1041 back just to the old WOGLA code. I have really gone through that very quickly. I want to have this slide up here for any contact information or any questions, but I do want to just make one more final emphasis here, and that emphasis is, again, that planning doesn't begin with an application. Planning begins before the formal application is received. And a robust planning meeting and meaningful participation by all parties involved in that pre-application step should help everyone. It should help Weld County. It should help the COGCC through your permitting process. It should give some level of certainty to the operator. And it should help with meeting or beating deadlines and timeframes for permitting processes as well, especially when we're talking about providing referral comments back to Weld County through our process, which has a deadline on it, and meeting the COGCC's rule-defined deadlines as well. We view this as definitely similar also to what Mr. Baumgarten said a minute ago. This should be a concurrent process for a majority of the time, with knowing the fact that through our process and our hearing officer will hear the case, give a final order, and then the COGCC would also have to go through the remainder of their process and any additional things that their permit might require. So it is kind of a blended approach. However, that concurrent process is very vital to not only Weld County, but it should also be to the COGCC, and that coordination, collaboration, and cooperation with these permits we think is very critical all the way up at the very front. So we would highly encourage that outlook from you all as well, and would encourage and look forward to future working relationships on any permits that are received by Weld County. So with all that being said, again, I appreciate your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that the commission may have.
Thank you, Mr. Maxey, for that presentation. I think these presentations have been excellent, and I think just kind of as a comment, it illustrates for our stakeholders and for our commission the job that's going to need to be done for this commission and each of the local governments that regulate oil and gas. We need to collaborate well with each other. We have our permitting protocol and regulations. Each of the communities that we've discussed with this morning goes about it a little bit differently, and I think that the hallmark of getting this done right is to collaborate correctly so that we're able to honor the respective regulatory protocols. So again, appreciate the overview of your process. I don't know that I have any questions at this time. I'm looking around at my fellow commissioners and looking for hands. I see Commissioner McGowan and then Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Maxey, for sharing your presentation today. I think it's also pretty evident that there's going to be 101 different ways for local governments to work through their oil and gas application process, and it's been so informative to learn about all of these different policies and all these different procedures. So I appreciate it. I have a couple of questions. So my first question was, is there a definition? So you were talking about how property owners and homeowners get noticed. Is there, and you were saying it's in code, who gets noticed? Is it based on how far away they are from the proposed application? Does it just include your Weld County residents? If you are near the border, for example, and you have a neighboring jurisdiction, if they're within the definition of your code, would those neighbors also get notified?
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan, and that is a good question. And the answer is similar to Adams County, where we take a look at it doesn't matter about the border, so to speak, whether that's a municipal border, of which in Weld County we have 32 different municipalities, and we're obviously surrounded not only by multiple counties, but also by a different state to the north of us. So we do take a look across the border. I will say that in a majority of our permits, though, if we're getting into a situation today, or especially since our 1041 rules and regulations have been implemented with some of our new code requirements, the operators definitely do their best to try to stay away from a little bit more of the heavily developed areas. And I think you've heard that from other entities as well. But yes, we have within that defined 1041 WOGLA area, that is a code defined area. And currently that area is 1,000 feet from the edge of the disturbance area. So I acknowledge there's a little bit of a discrepancy between our rules and the state rules. However, that is a point of discussion right now that I will say that we are having. So no more on that at this time, but we are discussing that distance. If you are a homeowner, which it fits under the definition of a building unit within our code, you would receive notice. If you are a property owner, that is one thing that is unique, I believe, to our code that we implemented at the change of the 1041 rules, so of August of last year. That was not included when the department was formed in 2019, but when we redid our rules in 2020, property owners were included. And so any property owner, regardless of if they have a home or any other building unit defined structure within that 1,000-foot zone, you would get a notice as a property owner, and likewise to other entities as well. So again, if you are a municipality, a county, a school district, a fire district, things like that, an HOA even. We've sent notices to HOAs before. Again, this is something that we take a look at to see who the affected parties are, and we do our absolute best to make sure that all those affected parties, regardless of jurisdictional boundary lines, receive that notice.
Thank you. So when it comes to folks having the opportunity to testify in front of your commissioners, is it similar to how we have it where we kind of define affected parties and who can come and testify? Do you have something similar?
We do, and again, we call ours intervention.
Intervention.
So we have the word intervention party, which there is an intervention. We don't have a definition for intervention party, but we have a process by which a community member could file, lay out their reasoning for feeling like they are an affected party, and that application is reviewed and either granted or denied from the hearing officer. We've had intervention parties on multiple cases before that have gone through the process, that have come to our hearings and testified as to what they believe they are affected by or how this development would affect them. And so that has been used multiple times. To date, we have not done a denial for an intervention party. But the process for intervention is meant to include people, again, who are affected. So I think that the commission could understand, and how we set this up was so that if there's a special interest group who wants to testify, they can still submit written comments, but are you truly an affected party? That determination needs to be met, and it is reviewed and determined in our process. A slight difference that I do want to make sure that the COGCC is aware of, not only for your input onto an application, but also for other referral entities, because remember, we have notices that go out, and then we have our referral requests that go out. The notices go out to those property owners, those homeowners, et cetera. The referral requests go out to agencies, of which the COGCC is one, a school district would be another one, a fire district would be another one, as an example. On those referral forms, we have an option on there to simply check a box to include some basic comments about what your concerns are. But when you check that box saying you want to participate in our hearing, you don't have to worry with filling out that application for intervention and go through that process. You are a defined referral agency, and we want to make sure that if you need to be at our hearing and provide comment based on your referrals, that you have an option to do that simply by checking the box and being able to show up to the hearing.
Thanks. So similar to some questions I've been asking other folks, how do you work with neighboring jurisdictions? If you know that development's going to be near one of them?
Well, again, right now, our current code talks about 1,000-foot boundary from the disturbance area. So that would be the #1 primary way that we work with neighboring jurisdictions of any type. Again, whether that's an HOA or a school district, or if that's a municipality or a different county, that is how our code is written right now. 1,000 feet from the disturbance area, and it's an automatic code required item. I will say, though, that our staff and myself takes a little bit more pragmatic approach to some of the applications, depending on the location within the county. And we have, in some instances, gone beyond that code requirement of 1,000 feet for entities that have been outside of 1,000 feet. So we do have examples to where we've done that. But again, it's on a case-by-case, location-by-location specific type of determination when we do that, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And then last question also that I've been asking other folks is how you've been dealing with the reverse setback and working with developers and permits and the chicken and the egg and which comes first, and disclosure to homeowners and how that's been working for you all.
Sure, and thank you for that as well, because I did pick up on those questions. And again, this is kind of a multi-departmental type of process, because we handle obviously oil and gas development. Our planning department handles applications for planned unit developments or PUDs, small subdivisions that might be applied for out in the county, things like that. So right now, what I can say is that we are looking at reverse setbacks or reciprocal setbacks. But currently, oil and gas has the more strict setbacks as far as the requirement of them and that development to be away from other developments such as homes or planned subdivisions, things like that. On the planning side of it, it's based on the zoning of the location, and different zoning could have different setback requirements within them. So for example, agricultural zoning, if you're building a house in the ag zone, there's a defined setback within the agricultural zoning section of our code that says what that setback is from existing oil and gas facilities. Whereas if you're in a residential zoned area of the county, which there's not too many of, but we do have, it's a different setback, okay? We are looking at, #1, making those a little bit more, I guess, consistent would be the best word, and that reciprocalness of the different codes within the county for oil and gas and development. But right now, they are different.
Thank you.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Maxey. This is really helpful to learn about the process. And I think I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what Commissioner McGowan was just mentioning. And these are some questions also that some of the other commissioners raised with respect to the timing of these different processes. So again, with the understanding that the planning department handles those kinds of issues with the platting of a new development, how does that work with respect to an oil and gas location that has already been approved but not drilled versus a plat that's been established and an oil and gas permit application coming in? can you kind of elaborate a little further on that?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that question, Commissioner. That goes back again to the importance of the way our process is set up and the importance of the referral period for other agencies. So as I mentioned on that slide, even though I did it very briefly, I just said Weld County departments. Other Weld County departments are referral entities. What that means is that our Public Works Department actually gets a referral for oil and gas planned locations. Our Environmental Health Department gets a referral. Our Planning Department gets a referral. There is that cross coordination and communication within Weld County. Just the same on the planning side of things. When they have a permit that is pending, the Oil and Gas Department gets a referral from the Planning Department and asks for our comment on this proposed development that is happening under the Planning Department's jurisdiction. That way we can catch any type of potential conflict, because again, we're not just looking at a location and what is there right now. We need to look and consider the other areas of land use that are happening around the location that could be a problem. We might get a referral from the Public Works Department that there's a major road project that's happening that maybe wasn't indicated on any documentation, but through that referral process, that is kind of again, the checks and balances that Weld County does, not just within our own county, but again, that's our hope for the other entities that we engage with as well, is that they will tell us certain things like that. And again, if we back up even further, hopefully some of those can be identified at the pre-application meeting so that the operator doesn't march forward with their preferred location, and then after they've submitted an application and gone through all the time and process of putting together that robust packet to Weld County and to the state, then they find out that there's a problem, because nobody appreciates that, and that's not good planning. So we do our best to do cross referrals, internal and external, but that highlights the importance of a thorough review of the application materials and of being a part of the process along the way, so that we can hopefully identify any of those types of other land use conflicts that might be out there. Because when you're looking at compatibility and cumulative impacts, you have to have that information, right?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. And just to put a slightly finer point, I'm just wanting to understand the specifics of the timing. So you mentioned that the permit or a location once approved, there's 3 years where that clock starts. What about on the platting of a subdivision or a commercial development or a road or et cetera? How does that work?
Oh gosh. If I kind of was smiling when you all were asking some questions about the planning stage of the process for other entities that presented, because if I would have known about that, I might have had our planning director be a part of this as well and give me some help. I do know that USRs, use by special reviews, that goes through a different process, similar to what Adams County mentioned earlier and other entities, to where there's a planning commission meeting and then approval by the Board of County Commissioners. And that use by special review stays with the property. So it could have a very long time period associated with it unless it gets rescinded for some reason or revoked for some reason. So there's a different time period for that. There's a different time period for applications for subdivisions or other planning type of uses. Obviously, we had, and it's changed recently, but there has been a recorded exemption process, and we still allow it in certain cases to split land into smaller parcels. Usually that was, a dry corner of a pivot to where somebody wanted to build a home on that corner for the farming family. Once a recorded exemption is done, a home might not be built on there for decades. We've seen multiple examples to where those were done and just not built on for years. So it's a little hard for me to answer since I don't absolutely handle those processes, but there are different timeframes associated with those permits in and of themselves. There are different requirements within those permitting processes. And I could definitely reach out to our planning director and kind of get a list of the permits that they review and that they approve through their department. And I could email you some of those timeframes to the commission if that would be helpful.
Thank you so much. I think that would be helpful. And one of the questions that had come up is, I think it was Adams County mentioning that, you know, in some instances, if there's already an oil and gas location in place and it's already in production, you know, there's a reverse setback, and they make sure that the subdivision or whatever, you know, is at least that far away. But if it's a location that is coming in, if it's a new location, then it's subject to the new setbacks, you know, which are larger, which are 1,000 feet in their case. I think that you said the same for Weld. But if they're kind of happening around the same time, there can be negotiations, at least between the developer and the operator, to not construct until drilling and completion has occurred. Does anything like that happen in Weld, or do you have any requirements for that kind of timing restriction?
Yes, we have seen instances of that in past applications, to where a referral comment may come back saying, this other activity is happening on this location that's adjoining the property or the area that the oil and gas location is being proposed to be on. And we have talked about those types of timing stipulations with the developer or whomever is the person making those comments, the landowner or the other entity, for example, a referral entity. And we've also talked about that on our side with the operator group. And I think that I'm sure, as you all know, one of the more recent ones that we've definitely had multiple instances of experience with would be CPW. Through some of the new regulations with wildlife stipulations, we've seen a lot of referrals come back talking about various wildlife in certain areas, certain timing stipulations based on either migration or breeding seasons or winter habitat, things like that. And that is something that we are getting more and more used to from that agency, at least, talking about some stipulations on timing. So we absolutely do get those from time to time, and probably more in the future with more development happening in Weld County and Colorado in general. And we absolutely take that into consideration as we are going through the process, and the hearing officer is determining what needs to be done for his final order and the questioning that he does during the hearings.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Maxey. That was a really good presentation and a lot of information in a short amount of time. So I've got a few questions, just making sure that I understand a few different things here. Understanding the new process, and now it's been in place for a couple of years, almost. And when you're reviewing applications through that process, are you reviewing those applications against a certain standards, whether those are noise, odor, impacts to roads, whatever the different standards may be within your code, or are you reviewing those directly against referrals, or both?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner, and very good question. Throughout the various stages of the process that I outlined, it's both, if we're looking at the process as a whole. Our code has multiple sections in it. We break it down into, obviously, the application type of section. We have the hearing section, and then we have an article at the end of our 1041 code that is completely development standards and the requirements that our code requires for the operators to adhere by, okay? So those standards that are in our development area may include things like weeds, lights, noise, dust, odor, things like that. And we have various requirements for all of those things. Drainage would be another one. We have drainage and grading requirements as well. So I would say at the front end of the process, those development standards, when we are, again, in that pre-planning process, we look at the site-specific location. We look at the siting analysis of the operator, which again is a requirement 100% of the time for Weld County. We do not have any stipulations about this requires a siting analysis and this does not. Every single location, they have to do a siting analysis. Now, we do have different requirements for different areas of the county about the number of alternate sites that have to be considered. So I do want to be clear about that. But we look at them at that stage is where we really start going over the very site-specific nature of their proposal and what development standards may rise to the top of importance compared to some of the others that are just inherently taken care of through the process on a usual basis. So we look at that way up at the front throughout the application process as well to make sure that the application addresses the standards that we have in our code. But then again, the importance of the referral process is that the COGCC, for example, might say, you know, we think this other best management practice should be included, or we think this other condition should be placed on the permit. We don't know that unless somebody asks us for that to consider, right? And so that's the importance of that referral process, is that we do take those into consideration as a staff, number one, in preparation of our report, and then number two, in the hearings. And again, I would encourage and be happy to pass along any of our hearing invites to you all, so you could join in remotely even if you'd like. But our hearing officer asks if the applicant, number one, received all the referral comments that were sent in and that our staff received. And number two, we talk about, is there any questions about them? You know, how have you addressed those comments? Some of them might not need to be a condition of approval for the permit, so to speak. But if there's a comment or a concern from a referral agency, the hearing officer asks about that in hearing and gets the applicant on record about, have you had any interaction with this comment party? Do you plan to mitigate this in any form or fashion? Things like that. So they absolutely are very important. And that plays into your question about what do we look at? We look at both. We look at our development standards and we consider the referral comments very heavily.
Great. No, I appreciate that. Mr. Chair, I've got a few questions here, if I could just keep going.
Please.
So, and I'd ask this to some of the other presenters as well. But my understanding is that Weld County is a zoned county. Are there particular zones that oil and gas activity is allowed in, you know, whether that's ag or commercial or whatever, or is it allowed in any zone?
Great question, Commissioner, and you are correct. Weld County has multiple zones. Oil and gas development, the 1041 WOGLA process is allowed in all zone districts as long as they have a 1041 WOGLA permit. So regardless of the zone district, they can apply. Again, though, I will say that as development happens, we are definitely seeing obviously a more awareness on the operator side. On our end, we're looking at those compatibility type of issues. And so for a 1041 WOGLA permit to be submitted in our residentially zoned districts, which are few and far between, we have not had that happen yet. It's 95 or 97% of Weld County that is zoned agricultural. And so predominantly, in fact, right now, 100% of our 1041 permits have been in the ag zone. We have not seen one in any other zone district, but those zoning districts in Chapter 23 of our code do stipulate that if they do have a 1041 permit, they could go into other zones as well.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was just reading, I don't remember where I read it, but that there was some review that was going on regarding new regulations around solar facilities as well, and that you have Ag 1, Ag 2, Ag 3, and there was different requirements that were being contemplated there. Do you have different contemplations between Ag 1, 2, and 3 with the oil and gas operations?
So maybe a multi-layered answer here. So we do have different zone districts. We just have the agricultural zone district, but we have R1, R2, we have commercial 1, 2, industrial, et cetera. So there are different requirements based on those different zone districts in Chapter 23, which is generally the planning chapter of our code. Regarding stipulations in the oil and gas code, Chapter 21, we have a map. We have an appendix that is part of Chapter 21. It's Appendix 21B, and that is a map that divides the county up into two different planning areas. We have the ag rural planning area, and we have the near urban planning area. And I could probably spend more time than you all want going over the differences. But the point is that we have identified those two areas in code, and there are different standards within that development standards section that I just talked about as well, depending on which area you're in. So for the oil and gas code, it's not necessarily so much which zone you're in. The zoning code allows for oil and gas in any zone as long as we have a 1041 local permit. The oil and gas code allows for oil and gas development in both of those planning areas, but there are, and there can be, and there usually is, different and more stringent stipulations depending on which one of those planning areas you fall into on that map that's included in our code. Now that map is dependent on multiple factors, but one of them is municipal boundaries. And there's a buffer that's drawn around municipal boundaries, which is included in that near urban area. And obviously that changes. And so the idea with that map is obviously it's going to be a living map. It's not just codified once and that's just what it is. That map will be updated. We've talked about at least on a yearly basis, so that we have the best information on there as far as, number one, what the operators can view and where they know they might be located, so they know what standards to apply, and also from staff's viewpoint, so that we can, to the best of our ability, look at our criteria and our development standards to apply to each and every one of these locations.
No, I appreciate that. That's good information. And it's super complicated. So I appreciate the work that you guys are doing around that. One of the things, well, you had just mentioned it, is this relationship between county and municipalities within the county and or adjacent counties or municipalities. And I mean, my understanding, I think what I heard you say was that they, depending on where they're at least if it's 1,000 feet, then certainly they get notice. Perhaps there's some stipulations that you may offer notice further than that. First question is, what does that notice allow that adjacent municipality to have? I mean, does that give them standing or intervention status in your process, during the hearing process? And are there other IGAs or ad hoc negotiations that go on between the different jurisdictions that help guide not only oil and gas development, but development in general between the different entities?
Great question, Commissioner. Thank you. Again, so there are other agreements, and again, I'm going to say they're more in line with the other development that you just mentioned. So we do have coordinated planning agreements between Weld County and multiple jurisdictions within Weld County. Those agreements, though, are not a part of oil and gas development. They have different planning stipulations and different requirements for the distances from those jurisdictions. That is not a part of the oil and gas regulations, but we do have those agreements to answer that part of your question for other development, other planning processes. As an example for what we look at, if we are sending a referral to another entity, so let's take out homeowners and property owners because they get notice if they're within that 1,000 feet like we talked about. But if we're sending a referral request to an adjoining entity, if they are, in our opinion, an affected party, they're going to get a referral. To be honest with you, we used to say the term courtesy referral. We've changed that because if you're getting a referral, that's not a courtesy. We're asking for your input on this, right? You are impacted in some way. One of the best examples I could give you right now is an impacted community if a haul route is planned to go through an area that another jurisdiction has already annexed into their town boundaries. We want to make sure that that town, number one, is aware of the development, and number two, has an ability to comment and or participate in our hearing process. We find that very important. So obviously that has to stop somewhere. We're not looking 20, 30 miles out for a haul route, right? But if the haul route goes through an annexed area, we have sent out multiple referrals that are outside of that 1,000 feet because, again, we view that as an impacted jurisdiction, an impacted party, and we want that input from them as well and their participation.
Thanks for that answer. I appreciate that. couple other questions and then I'll be quiet. I guess and I don't want to get into any kind of legal stuff here, but I'm a little curious, and I meant to ask some of the previous presenters this as well, but I know that some local governments are exercising authority to permit and review pipelines. And I know that there's some preempted legalese that is involved with that, depending on what type of pipeline it is. And I'm talking about the pipelines that are not regulated by the COGCC. Are you guys doing that as well? I think you had indicated that you're reviewing pipelines and permitting pipelines through the WOGLA process.
So not exactly. So let me clarify. This department does review pipeline applications. The current regulations for pipelines that would require a permit through this department are natural gas pipelines 12 inches or larger, and petroleum products other than natural gas that are 13 inches and larger go through our pipeline permitting process. Through your recent flow line rulemaking that happened in November of 2019, you all obviously take care of flow lines under that definition, and you have a very nice and robust mapping ability on your website, which we appreciate. We view that as a planning tool, to be honest with you. I mean, that's great. So those are captured under there, under your new rules and regulations. Anything that's not captured as a flow line or that under that definition of flow line and is not captured under the LAP process, they may have to do other permits, whether it might be a federal permit if it's an interstate pipeline or if it's something that's regulated by the PUC. But as far as the county goes, we have those classified as a use by right. So they don't need the full-blown permit through this department. They would still need to get other permits such as right-of-way permits, access permits, things like that are impactful to other departments like Public Works. But there's not the full-blown comprehensive permit process that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, that makes sense. Last question, I think. So old process and the new process. The new process has the hearing officer and the hearing process that you've talked about, and then the old process. I assume those were mostly administrative review at that point, or because of you didn't have the hearing officer and the existing process now. Now with the hearing officer and the review process that goes to the hearing officer, is there an appeal process to the BOCC, or do these go to a consent agenda to the BOCC, or is the hearing officer the final say on these applications?
Thank you very much for that. So you're correct. Old WOGLA process did not have hearing officer or that staff at that time. It was an administrative process through the director, through myself, and then through the director of the planning department at that time. It was administratively reviewed and approved or denied, either one. But through the new process with our hearing officer, we absolutely do have an appeals process within Chapter 21 of our code. Now, that needs to be looked at like it's not getting appealed to the board for a different determination on the case as a whole. It's getting appealed for a certain reason about did the hearing officer do or not do his job, or for a very specific reason. So the Board of County Commissioners would remand the case either back to the hearing officer for further consideration, or they would deny the appeal, saying that basically they uphold the hearing officer's decision and that was correct what he did.
Okay, and then the hearing officer is the ultimate final decision maker there then. So it doesn't have to get final approval from the BOCC.
From that standpoint, you are correct. Once the hearing officer makes an order, it is final, it is recorded, it is legally noticed in the newspaper. It does not get final approval from the BOCC. The only path to the BOCC is through that appeals process that we just talked about.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Other commissioners with questions? Great. Mr. Maxey, thank you very much for your time today for explaining the Weld County process. Really appreciate your coming to us and providing that perspective. We look forward to working with your community as we are going to be engaging with the local governments across the state. So we'll be in touch. And thanks again for presenting today.
Thank you very much, Commission, and Chairman Robbins, thank you. And I will echo that as well. We thoroughly look forward to further engagement with the COGCC and working cooperatively together throughout both of our processes. So we really appreciate the time being able to present to you today. Thank you. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, commissioners, at this point, we are at our quote lunch break and executive session. I'm going to look to AAG Davenport now. I have a feeling that we're going to want to have a motion to move into executive session now, and then go into executive session and perhaps taking a quick break to get some lunch for each of us. But AAG Davenport, do you want to lead the way here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's correct. We need a motion to go into executive session. I have to read my little script and identify the topics for that executive session, and then we'll need a motion after that. Commissioners, pursuant to the open meetings law, the commission is entitled to enter into an executive session at this meeting for the purpose of receiving legal advice pursuant to Colorado Revised Statute Section 24.6, 402(3)(a) Roman 2. The topics of the executive session were identified on the agenda for today. They are to receive legal advice and analysis on the general legal requirements for payment proceeds applications pursuant to Section 3460, 118.5, the process of COGCC rulemaking prior to submitting a notice of rulemaking to the Colorado Secretary of State, and general legal requirements for complaints and for petitions for review under COGCC rules. Mr. Chair, I invite you to encourage a motion to enter into executive session for the purposes I just listed.
So encouraged.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to go into executive session relevant to the items as described by AAG Davenport. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion carries. I think at this point, guys, we are to leave this Zoom meeting and go to the executive session Zoom meeting. And then for the members of the public, when we are done with executive session, we will come back to this Zoom meeting and continue with our agenda. And it's likely to be at least an hour before we come back to this meeting. It is now 12:38, so I would anticipate that we would not come back to this Zoom meeting to conclude business today until 1:45 at the earliest. Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, AAG Davenport.
Thank you. We're now in the public session. Commissioners, we have returned from executive session. During executive session, the commission received legal advice on the matters identified in the agenda, and that is the process of COGCC rulemaking prior to submitting a notice of rulemaking to the Secretary of State, and general legal requirements for complaints and petitions for review under COGCC rules. Though it was stated in the agenda due to time constraints, the commission did not receive legal advice and analysis on the legal requirements for payment of proceeds applications. No decisions were made and no votes were taken in the course of this executive session. Mr. Chair, I invite you to encourage a motion to exit executive session.
So encouraged.
So moved.
Second.
Well, we have a motion to leave executive session and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Agent Davenport, that motion passes. Do you have anything further to say?
I do not. Thank you, commissioners.
Great. All right, well, thanks, folks. There's still 29 of you sticking around. We are now done with executive session as noted. The last thing on our agenda is commissioner comments. Anybody have comments for the good of the order? Commissioner Hackett.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. I just had a couple things to share from things that are going on at CDPHE. I think some of the commissioners and members of the public who are listening in are already on the Air Pollution Control Division's oil and gas email list. And if you're not, I definitely recommend that. I got 2 reminders from that email list just today during this hearing that I wanted to share with folks. One was a reminder that the greenhouse gas inventory report that has been put out for public comment since January, just a reminder that that public comment period is ending on March 31st. That, as a reminder, that inventory is an update to the 2019 inventory, and it adds revised oil and gas production emissions. I'll go ahead and post that in the chats. If Mr. Thomas can make sure that gets to everyone, that would be great. And then the other thing I wanted to share is tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow evening, starting at 6 p.m. will be the next Air Pollution Control Division stakeholder meeting, public listening session on oil and gas greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies. And the website I'm posting right now has some of the strategies that are under discussion through that process. And then lastly, the only other item I wanted to mention, Commissioner McGowan has expressed an interest in having a presentation from the Supplemental Environmental Projects Coordinator at CDPHE. And it sounds like potentially April 7th might be an option, but most likely April 14th would be an option. So I will plan on letting that individual know that we'll shoot for April 14th, and I'll move slowly on it. So if staff or commissioners would want to propose an additional date, please get back to me in a couple days, and I'll let that gentleman know what your preference is. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Commissioner Hackett, for those updates. Always appreciative. Other comments from commissioners? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to express appreciation for all the presenters today from the different local governments. I actually found that really important information, and thank you, Chairman Robbins, for putting that together. I think that really helped create a baseline of knowledge for all the commissioners around, a lot of the different complexities that are involved with local land use decision making around oil and gas and the different approaches. So thank you for that.
Agreed. Thank you, Commissioner Messner, and my thanks as well to the panelists and to all of you for the good Q&A with the panel. Segueing on that front, my comment just to our stakeholders and to my fellow commissioners is along just to kind of daylight, John, some of the work that you and I have been doing with local governments. We have reached out via CCI and CML and to have information sessions between Commissioner Messner and myself and local governments who desire them. I know I've got like 5 or 6 on my calendar over the next month. Looking forward to those additional information sessions. And I also wanted to just kind of daylight the fact that as part of these discussions, the local government liaison piece that is COGCC is being, at least from my perspective, looked into a little bit. The employee who served as the local government liaison is retired, and so I'm going to use these opportunities to when I visit with local governments to inquire of them of how that program was working, what may have not been working, what could we do better, so that I can then bring that information back to Director Murphy, and we can, I don't know that we need to reinvent the local government liaison, but just sort of amp it back up. I think that today's presentations illustrated the need under SB 19-181 for us to work collaboratively with local governments. And I think that position or that approach deserves looking into and discussion with local governments. So that's just something that I've taken it on myself, and I know a lot of these folks from my previous work, and so I just wanted to let the commissioners know about those opportunities that are going to exist on my calendar for the next month or so. And we've had a pretty good response. Probably, I don't know, a dozen or so communities have asked to have these discussions. So looking forward to that. Looking around to see if anybody else has comments. The last piece I had is I was informed by our wonderful staff that the COGCC website now has an instructional docket or document that shows people how to get into the financial assurances information docket. So that's online. It's probably at the financial assurances page, but what we walk through here at the beginning is now 1, 2, 3 laid out so that folks can go get that and get in there and take a look at what people have filed. All right, seeing no further comments, we've reached the conclusion of our agenda. I would look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Great, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Great. Take care, everybody.